Okay. आवाज थोड़ी सा कर लो. Okay, so I hope my voice is audible. A very good afternoon to all of you. Okay, I think some of you would have already seen the test, the paper 1 discussion. So today we are gathered to see the discussion for paper 2. In fact, many of you would have been waiting to analyze and understand what exactly to make of paper 2. Okay, thank you, Rohan. Okay, all the people who have joined in. So today we are also going to understand with paper 2. Now, before I start, see in paper 1 this year, of course, the format was that we saw the questions, we linked it to the paper. So what is the format of this analysis and discussion? In fact, I can say the format and the approach. See, of course, we will be seeing that directly from the syllabus, are we seeing some questions or not? Number one, there are questions, but of course the number of these questions is limited, very less. Okay. Second is, we'll also see the difficulty of questions, and when I say difficulty, it means the level of interconnections or linkages a question has. We'll also try to understand that, right? Because here some of you who have already given the mains of 2025 are watching it. If you're preparing for 2026, you've done your foundation, you are also maybe watching it. But let's say you are very new for 2026, 2027 and beyond, this can also be, so you also want to understand. So the purpose for us is to see and analyze these questions in depth, okay? So we also see this. One of the most asked questions is, how many questions have a bearing of current affairs, okay? And a very rough estimate, I will say that around 70% questions or even more have a bearing of current affairs. We'll also see the themes which have been asked. Now, when I say the themes in paper 2 very specifically, you see direct mention of Trump, his tariffs, his transactional diplomacy being a core feature of this paper. Not one, but even for EU, even for Latin America, and for other case, the question has been asked. Directly what you see, right? A question on India's response on the Pahalgam attack. And the question says, is this India's hyper-realist response? Okay, so that means whatever is in the news, and some recent points have been asked, but there have been instances of even older current affairs repeating themselves. For example, there is a mention of the 6 phases of Indian foreign policy, right? Dr. S. Jaishankar. You've already done the classes of crash course. We start our lectures on Indian foreign policy by those 6 phases. Now, we cannot then argue that, sir, this is an old theme. Why is it getting repeated? The point is, the UPSC examiner has this, that they don't only have to ask you 1 year or 6 months, they can ask you in broad depth, right? So we will see wherever current affairs. I will also be telling you the approach to answer writing, and of course, for some questions, I will give you certain templates and points to think. But here again, I would expect for the questions in which I give you a broad overview, you still try to find, when I say template, how to introduce that question. In the body, main thing is which dimensions can I explore, because in paper 2 you will have different challenges. In paper 2 challenges are different, okay? So when we see the body also, right? So which dimensions, which keywords to emphasize, and then of course equally important, sometimes people ask, so which scholars are we supposed to quote? Now this year again the question paper was unique in the sense you did not find many repetitive questions. Ab question seedhe pooch raha aapse, what are the non-traditional threats seen in the food and the environmental crisis, for example. A lot of these questions have to be thought on the spot, right? So for these questions your thinking exercise will be very handy. So for some questions I will ask you to again go back and read through this, right? So please, when you find this, try to be as attentive as possible, and of course whenever you see the video, this is going to be on YouTube as a live, maybe you see it after 1 week, some days, etc. Whatever are your takeaways from the video, you can also drop that as a comment, or if there is anything you want to ask and perhaps need more clarification, okay, that can also be there, so you can drop that as a comment, fine. So we'll be focusing on the syllabus linkages. We'll also be seeing the difficulty of questions. We'll also be seeing which themes have been asked, and not only that, how to answer certain questions. There are some questions for which you know the content, not a very difficult job, but specifically the questions in which, let's say, you have limited content, and how to brainstorm and think is also what we're going to see. And lastly, which always should be something, a very important component of any of these discussions, is your takeaways and the lessons for 2026. This is something we cannot ignore, okay, and even for beyond. Now, we've already heard this quote that history repeats itself, okay. In fact, people who had analyzed 2024 paper, in fact, when we started the crash course of 2025, I had started my first lecture with the analysis of 2024. The 2024 paper 2 was highly dynamic in nature, okay, which is why there is no surprise that this year, if the current affairs is huge, the interlinkage and the difficulty wise there's a challenge. So one can also say that now the new normal of paper 2, you cannot go and revise the old themes and expect to write an answer. For example, if ASEAN is mentioned in the syllabus, the examiner is going one step beyond. They're asking you ASEAN +3. That is a specific question, okay. Let's say the question is on RCEP, then merely the knowledge of ASEAN will not help you, right? So again, the point is, this is an important point. And for that, I'll also tell you how you can organically do this, how to keep a tab, which is why for almost all the topics which are inspired from current affairs, I have added the screenshot to show whether they were inspired from the newspaper, any other article. And uski baad bhi aisa nahi hai that across that you will be following the tab of every other periodical, every other magazine, every other newspaper, but still we'll try to see what can be done, which a normal aspirant can do without disturbing their schedule, okay. I hope, the track of this systematically, we'll see that. And Rohan, this we had very well done in our crash course also, which is why a lot of questions which are here, with full honesty and sincerity, I'll tell you which were there. The ones which are not there, I'll also tell you, okay. But specifically for paper 2, the new normal is, okay, that one has to be very updated, okay, which will again serve us good. Till here, are we able to follow people online? Okay, so I think this will set the tone of the paper. Okay, so now we'll go one by one, fine. Now I'll be switching to, we'll have a look at the UPSC paper, and then of course we'll go through the slides also, just to get a fair overview. Now, we are seeing the paper, you have paper 1A, and directly this is the section that you see in terms of the questions, right? This is the first block, this is compulsory, right? Now, overview I'll give you. The very first question may be slightly unsettling. The very first question is, discuss the psychological approach to the study of comparative politics. Second question, neo-liberalism lightened neo-realism's dark view of international politics. Third question, explain the non-traditional security threats in the context of food and environmental crisis. Discuss political socialization, ab usko aur mushkil kaise kar diya, of open and closed societies. And normally you read about a political sociology approach, but socialization then becomes an even broad term in that sense. And you have to compare it in open and closed societies, and then comment on the red lipstick movement in the context of feminist rights. Now, these are 5 questions, right? Apart from, let's say, the question of neoliberalism, which is directly, when you read about liberalism, neoliberalism, that there is the approaches and theories of IR. There's a very famous neo debate. In fact, there's also neo debate with neo-Marxism, neoliberalism, and neo-realism. This question I can say you can directly answer, but for other questions, okay, be it red lipstick or even socialization, you have to apply your mind in the paper, which is why at the very outset, the compulsory section of paper 2A is not easy. Now, this is a tool the examiner will use against you. The question says psychological approach, but here also your psychology in the exam. Now, please remember the paper, if it is tough, it will be tough for everybody. These are not traditional. Otherwise, पहले क्या होता था? Direct topic पे सवाल आता था. Social movements, see that question. Okay? Question on political economy approach. So people had the habit कि यार ये तो हम आराम से कर ले जाएंगे, right? Even in last year, there were a couple of questions which are slightly offbeat. This year, of course, I'm not saying these are very traditional. These are offbeat questions. barring the question on paper 2B, and this is exactly like how you see. Now, what should be the approach? Okay, so here a couple of points I'll tell you. Just say, see, PYQs will always be relevant. The point is examiner, this is again the prerogative of the examiner, how much they want to track and how much they want to address. Okay, so again this is a point which we will see again and again we will want to elaborate on this part. Okay, now number one, I hope we have seen this. I'll also tell you how to answer some of these questions, how to think through, and even in the exam hall, even if we have less content, whatever we have, how to write that. Take academically, post facto, and even I say in the hindsight, we can create very good answers. But also remember, some of these questions are difficult in the exam hall. So abhi what approach I'll give you is what we can also think through the exam. Yes or no? Ab hum aate hain, let's go back to the slide. Fine. Now, when we are done, we'll also be mapping the syllabus. And please also note, 1 year paper does not need to change radically your approach of understanding. Normally in paper 2, it is said you should also balance your theory, that is the static, with current affairs. So that is not something unusual. But it will depend. Ho sakta hai agli baar, the question in the compulsory sense is more static in nature. So that does that mean, do we need to abandon? No, we need to add on. What you are doing, you have to do that. But on top of that, in some questions, you have to be slightly, you have to brainstorm and do better. Now, this is the syllabus. We'll also be mapping the questions as per the syllabus. Now let us go one by one. We are starting with the very first part, discuss the psychological approach to comparative politics. While doing comparative politics, you read about traditional approaches. You also read about modern approaches, okay? But specifically, you may have not read about this approach, okay? But does that mean, do we need to leave this question? Not at all. Because still, if I know, in this question also, I will have an introduction. I can talk still about what is comparative politics and the approaches of comparative politics. In the body, I will talk about, I will just try to explore what this approach can be, because directly this is not there in your syllabus and you don't read about. But still, we have to attempt it, what we can do. देखो नाम क्या है, psychological approach. Who has a psychology here? You have your individuals, you have your actors. Individual actors can have a psychological approach. So when we go into the individual actor level analysis, we also get to understand how these actors can shape policies, how these actors can shape institutions. Right? This actor level analysis, because this is the psychological approach across societies, be it developed or developing. Can this also help me understand, let's say, the voting behavior of people? Okay. Similarly, if I want to again analyze how certain policies have evolved with certain people, because that is why I'm talking of psychological approach, I can also do that. In a comparative sense, if we talk about, for example, it is the developing countries where you have more and more charismatic leaders, yes or no? Whereas developed countries, they have more institutionalized political parties. So psychological approach can also be helpful in sometimes in understanding the developing areas. Kyun? Because of the rise of the leaders, for example, in this case. Okay, some can be demagogues, or some can actually be, okay, certain charismatic leaders. So the point is, based on your logical thinking and approach, in the body 3 or 4 points you will be able to talk about. You can also make a parallel. For example, when I say realism, हमने पढ़ा है classical realism. Who is the person associated with that? Morganthau, Hans Morganthau. And Hans Morganthau has again done an actor level analysis. And later on, Kenneth Waltz has done what? A structural, right, analysis. But I'm just making a comparison, right? So there have been instances of psychological, the human motivations, etc., which have also defined how the word order can be, and which has also led to understanding of comparative politics. Another thing to note here, in the modern approaches, you have economy, political economy approach, sociology, you also have psychological approach. Just that we don't explicitly read that in our syllabus. Fine. So based on whatever you would have known in this question, at least we can write it. Of course, then we can conclude that how this helps us in the understanding. So this is how, especially in a tougher question where you do not know, you still, based on your knowledge, can write this. Okay? See, Rohan, these kind of questions will be difficult for all. Okay, so let's say we go into too much of detail. Let's say you read through IGNOU text, etc. whatever is a traditional text, one can go through that, right? But other than that, हो सकता है अगली बार फिर सवाल ही ना आए इस पे, because this question, even if you go and do the source tracing, it may not be the best exercise, right? So whatever energy we have for the questions that are more doable, we should write them even better. That is my point always. Fine. So this is how you can talk about it. हर एक question में कोशिश करेंगे, and even somebody sees this video later on, how can you improve the introduction? Go back to your notes. Do you have any good introduction of comparative politics, right? How can you again brainstorm the points and how you can make these points even better, right? This is what you have to do even little later, because next exam में आपके पास almost 11 months हैं, almost, right? Huge time is there. So you have to have a mastery over the previous topics very well, okay? So that is one, but again now this opens up a new areas that other modern approaches which we normally don't cover, okay? Okay, either from the IGNOU material, etc. We can go through the other approaches as well, just to get a better understanding. Because again, this is one topic, comparative politics. Even one has done the traditional and the modern approaches, still there are sometimes challenges to understand this well. Okay, I hope you get the gist of how this is to be done, right? So this directly comes from this topic, comparative politics. हमें सवाल दिख रहा है, but what is mentioned here, examiner has gone one step beyond. Okay, now this is a question which people would have attempted fairly well. Okay, neo-liberalism, lightened neo-realism's dark view of international politics, and this is a question you have to mention properly. You can start with the context here, and I've told you the context. We've also done this in the classes in good detail, the neo debate, because realism has a dark view of international politics, because for them the world view is anarchical. Okay, there is no scope for cooperation, and liberalism from the very start, it will talk about multilateral institutions, it will talk about the scope of cooperation. ठीक है? Neo-liberalism, again let's say seen, so here of course we'll tell the context, we'll also tell the respective scholars, right? Of neo-realism, etc. we can talk about the analysis of Kenneth Waltz, whereas in neo-liberalism, Kyohane, Joseph Nye. अब फिर से देखो सवाल को, it has lightened the dark view. What is the dark view? The dark view was still that there is no scope of cooperation. The nations would always fight amongst each other. Why? Because everybody has a fight for survival. There is self-help, and because of lack of cooperation, ultimately there is going to be a security dilemma, right? If we expand that idea and logic, that is all what is being said. But neoliberalism, how does it lighten? It says that despite the tensions, see, first of all, they do not say that कि tensions नहीं है. Tensions are there, of course, but despite the tensions, there are still avenues of cooperation that are being seen, and that is best explained through the terms and ideas like complex interdependence. I can give you many examples that despite the tensions between US and China, don't they trade? They do trade. Right? I can also talk about democratic peace theory. The democracies don't generally go for a war. One reason is they are also very much economically integrated. So the neo-realism, and this question also tells you that when you have different perspectives to understand international relations, you get a broad understanding. So one does not only have to talk about कि भाई neo-realism only says that war, the power struggle, arms race. No, that despite the anarchical view, still there is some scope of cooperation. This is how it has lightened the view, a dark view of international relations. So in your answer, the examiner should find what is the meaning of dark view, right? Which is why, if you remember the old definitions of realism, right? They also say that these are the children of the dark. Why dark? Because there is a huge fight that is going on for survival, for self-help. But neoliberalism will try to tone it down. And the main difference is neoliberalism is different from liberalism. Liberalism says that everybody will be able to cooperate. Neo says no, there will be conflicts. But despite conflicts, the core idea remains that there is a scope for cooperation. Fine. This is one question. How will you present these arguments? How will you write these scholars and present it? And then scholars लिखे आपने, but एक चीज extra जरूर लिखोगे इसमें, some contemporary examples to support this. Otherwise, it will merely look like a academic theory type का answer. तो हमने context बताया, we've given the arguments via scholars, proper scholars, we've given contemporary examples, and then of course we conclude this. And this debate is in that sense a very important core feature of international politics. बहुत एग्जाम्पल्स हैं, जैसे अभी हमने बात करी इंडिया की, सॉरी यूएस एंड नहीं वो नहीं, दिस इज डिफरेंट, टोटली डिफरेंट, कॉन्टेक्स्ट डिफरेंट है, राइट. एंड no, neoliberal approach does not exactly represent the reality. That is the tough part. The tough part is, while there is scope of cooperation, it can again twist, because you again see the rise of tariffs, you also see. So there is always a tussle between these two. The moment you think there is more of neoliberalism, there is globalization, rules based order, WTO, uska bhi roll back ho jata hai. Uske against bhi there is a backlash, yes or no? So there is always a constant fight between these two. Sometimes you will see cooperation, which is why we say international order is in a state of flux. Right? I hope this would explain your point better. ठीक है? So we cannot simply say that it is only neoliberal. The word order, of course, has elements of neoliberalism, but even that is threatened, and that theme has also been asked not once but at least twice in paper 2A. The challenges globalization faces. एक question आया है democratic backsliding पे भी, which is also hinging on some of these elements. Okay? So I think this question we could have written. Now, explain non-traditional. अब ये question है open-ended. Non-traditional security threats in context of food and environmental crisis. Now, I've taken at least these topics. In our classes, we've done security. We've done the traditional view of security, the realist view of security, and we have also done the view of Barry Bouzan, okay, who talks about expanding the scope of human security. We've seen the concept of feminist view of power and security. The feminists say that the traditional realist view is what? Male-centric. It is purely only about arms race and protecting oneself. It does not go beyond that. Yes? In this context, you see this. Second is, while discussing about maritime security, हमने अलग से लिखा है अपने notes में traditional threats and non-traditional threats. You can also say traditional threats as, sorry, non-traditional threats as modern threats. Now, examiner has made your job easy by mentioning food and environmental crisis. Now, you can generate some points of food and environment, but the main challenge is to pack this entirely in the context of an answer. Yes? In this question, when you introduce it, you can talk about the changing landscape of security threats. Security was imagined only to be a traditional security threats. Now the nature is changing. Why? Because the issues are also changing. You cannot look world only from a state-centric view. Yes or no? So here you can give the introduction of the changing nature of security threats. Right? One of that is, yes, asymmetrical threats also, right? Now, and when you see explain karna hai, to simply you talk about how to, in the body we have to explain these. Now, food crisis may, let's say if I quote FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, what are the non-traditional threats in food crisis? Anybody? Simple points हैं ये, बताओ. सबसे बड़ा issue है of course issues of shortage, okay, main issue of food security, and all of this is ultimately food crisis, etc. is why is it happening? Because of refugee crisis, because of forever wars, yes or no? So because of the issues of refugees, right, the crisis that is there, that is also led to the exacerbating food crisis, number one. And I can, by the way, climate change is also leading to food crisis. Why? Because the yield per hectare is also decreasing. And environmental crisis is a separate point. I can also say climate change. Environmental crisis, I can talk about climate refugees, the new disasters. Right? So conventional security ka view kya hai? The states only want to save themselves from attacks, from arms, etc. New non-traditional threats can also be, if the people are not getting food, this also can create a security challenge, right? You have to think of all the people's shortage, food security, refugees, climate change. A lot of these points you have to think, but how will you weave this answer? You have to bring in the theoretical perspective. For example, you have to bring in the realist conception which only imagine the traditional threats, but you have to then talk about Barry Bouzan, the feminist view, etc. And यहाँ पे food and environment में you can also talk about the section on women, right? Women security. Now Barry Boza again expands and talks about the concept of human security. So the conception, main idea क्या है हम last में बताएंगे, that the conception of security needs to be reimagined. You cannot look again in the word from a only purely state-centric view, but you have to see this from a human-centric view. And humans face all these challenges. So not only are you writing the points, but you are presenting your answer through the academic theories that you generally read. Supporting examples can also be given. Let's say the cases of food shortages, etc. in Africa, in the Sahel region. And these regions can also lead to military coup, instability, weak governance, fragmented structures. Yes or no? So we can bring and weave across all these points. So aap log bhi, whosoever is following the discussion, right? Yes, this point is also good, that the traditional threats have not diminished. Wo last mein aana chahiye. In last you will balance both the points, that realist concerns is equally valid, but you also have to reimagine and reconceptualize security. So both things will play a very important role in this regard. Introduction we will talk about these security threats only, right? So इसमें भी when you see this, हाँ बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. When I say FAO, you can bring in data also. You can talk about the shortage. You can talk about जैसे अब if there is a food shortage, it will lead to a famine. Yes, तो Africa का points लिख लो, Latin America where there is poverty, it will also you can link this also to sustainable development goals in the end also. How this is also a challenge. So main thing is the concept of security has to be reimagined. Are we following this? So आप देख रहे हो ये question हमने on the spot बनाया है. Okay. So one thing, a very sincere advice to the people preparing for 2026, and we'll keep on writing these advices. एक अलग से column मैं बना रहा हूँ. Takeaways इसका. Okay. That you don't have to fear. Okay. First point is some questions will be tackled on the spot, which is why when you write your tests, बहुत बार क्या होता है, on the spot answer writing या point generation. Many times the students who join a test series, okay, answer writing program, you always wait for that golden moment कि सब तैयारी हो जाएगी. When I remember everything, then only I'll write. Not a good strategy. Especially for paper 2, there will be very dynamic questions. Not all these questions will be covered in every test series, very frankly speaking. So there will be some questions which will challenge you, but I'm not saying you cannot write that. You know the scholars, you know some points, all you have to do is bring them together. Fine? Okay. थोड़ा सा idea भी लग रहा है अच्छे से point को. अब let's say when you see the discussion, you note the basic points and ideas. I would again encourage, इन points को और refine करो. Okay, you still have issues, you again talk back and you again discuss this. अपना idea, the kind of analysis we do for prelims, if you've seen any of my videos of prelims analysis, we have to do even better analysis for mains. Okay, be it for GS or be it for optional. And for you, the people who have now seen the paper, आपके लिए ऐसा नहीं है कि you have to only do 5 out of 8. We have to do, and we have to see all the questions. That will again expand our perspective. And if you have done this exercise very well, next year when you see the paper, आपको कुछ trends, not all, some trends will repeat definitely. Okay, this is one of them. Okay, so there were articles, the global food crisis, international security threat in non-traditional security issues. I'll also be sharing this PDF later on in the group of the Sunya IAS channel. Some of these articles and their links, you can also go through that. ठीक है? अब देखो, simple सी line देखो आप. The biggest mistake in traditional security concept is it is too dominated by military approaches. This is nothing but realist approach. Can we say this? बिल्कुल. Right? Emerging non-traditional security threats, current realities, challenges for strategic planning, etc. इसीलिए अगर आप सवाल दूसरी तरह से आए, let's say if the question is critically analyze the concepts of security in 21st century, you have to mention both. अब आपको पता है, you have to talk about traditional threats, you also have to talk about non-traditional threats, both of them. This is how your answer will get better and it will have more weight. This is the core point we are trying to say. Yes or no? Okay, next आ जाओ. Discuss the political socialization of open and closed societies. Okay, which basically means, अब ये question, this becomes a tougher question. Why? This question is comparative. Now, if I just go back to the syllabus once, इस तरह के क्वेश्चन हम देखते हैं स्टेट इन कंपैरेटिव पर्सपेक्टिव में, राइट? द स्टेट इन कैपिटलिस्ट, सोशलिस्ट, एडवांस्ड, डेवलपिंग एटसेट्रा, वी कंपेयर देम. बट यहां पे क्या बोल रहा है? इन ओपन सोसाइटीज एंड क्लोज सोसाइटीज. व्हाट आर ओपन सोसाइटीज? Let's say loosely speaking democratic societies, right? Closed will be loosely speaking authoritarian regimes, yes or no? And the how is the political socialization, right? We have to compare that. So in this question you also have the scope, for example, of bringing comparative perspective either via examples. Ab simple si baat hai, in this question also the question is political socialization. We have read about a different approach, political sociology approach, right? But this approach of course is not the same, but some elements can be drawn, because this also is a question which is testing you. Ab you have two approaches. One is to surrender. Arey maine direct topic nahi padha hai, I'll leave it. But even if you try an attempt, you can still, this is a 10 marker, at least ho sakta hai aapko 3.5 marks you may get. But if you leave it, you will not get any marks. And in tough questions, always remember how much effort we put in. Questions may seem tough, but when you finally see the marks, आपको अरे यार toppers को 150 मिले हैं, कैसे? Tougher papers will have relative marking. It is not just with political science, maybe geography, anthropology, economy, etc. Different optionals. Every year we'll have one of the paper which is more difficult. Sometimes you forget it. फिर हम marks देखते हैं, अरे यार इन्होंने, and we assume somebody is getting 150, we will think उन्होंने सारे answers बहुत अच्छे लिखे हैं. But the question is, there will also be relative marking. Yes or no? So in this question again, we have to again see open societies, of course, will have free flow of information exchange. Closed ones do not allow that. Strict hierarchies in this place, whereas this is fluid in sense. This allows for falsification. I'm of course borrowing the terminology of Karl Popper here, etc. Right? Now, we will discuss how both socialization happens and is different in terms of the fluidity of people, like how the mobility of people will be there, number one. Different processes and institutions from a socialization angle, we have to examine this. Okay? If possible, of course, in political sociology, you read about certain thinkers, right? Directly to sociology, आपने नहीं पढ़ा होगा इसको, but at least a couple of points, be it Max, Weber, etc. Some of the approaches, of course, this is a more modern approach. But the idea, you can use it from a political sociology approach and write a comparative answer. At least this will be better, because directly you have not read political socialization as an approach. Because when you read modern approaches, economy आप पढ़ते हो, sociology आप पढ़ते हो, but socialization, and that too in the context of societies. So while this makes the question more specific in nature, but again in this question again I'm telling you, so आप देख रहे हो इस बार, in the 10 markers there is a struggle and there is a fight. Many times the examiner wants to see, where they put you under stress, but when you go to the 2B side, वहाँ पे काफी questions doable लग रहे हैं, right? So there can always be this tussle. Maybe one section is more difficult than the other, okay? But compulsory, we have to give our best effort, right? So here in this question, I've just given you an overview, okay? And this also, you can think of this as a slight homework, wherein you brainstorm the points and you create a structure. In the sense, you have to have a good introduction, how we will start this question. In the body, while you talk about socialization, how it happens, what are the different agents and agencies, and compare it for open and closed societies. इस क्वेश्चन में आपके पास ये भी स्कोप है, एक एक लाइन में इनको एक्सप्लेन करना, व्हाट आर दी सोसाइटीज एंड हाउ दे डिफर इन द पॉलिटिकल सोशलाइजेशन. दिस इज व्हाट यू कैन एक्सप्लेन अल्टीमेटली. फाइन. नाउ एक और क्वेश्चन which is slightly tricky in nature. Comment on the red lipstick movement in the context of feminist rights. Now, this is again not the first time a difficult question on this has been asked. Sometime back in 2017, direct question was also asked related to LGBTQ movements, okay, and linking it to social movement. इस क्वेश्चन में हो सकता है पहली बार you're seeing this for the very first time in the exam. The red lipstick movement in the context of feminist rights, okay. The main thing to remember, even if you do not know, let's say you are not aware about it, then what you should do, you should write an overall general approach in how a movement basically talks about feminist rights. जिसको नहीं पता होगा, you still can write a general answer. For example, sometimes they ask you a specific movement and they mention, let's say, environment के context में, or they mention human rights, or they mention some other case. If you, so there are always two ways. One, you can write specific, but for that you need specific knowledge, or you can write general. In this question, if you do not know exactly, you can write that. But let's say now we have read it, आपने पढ़ लिया है, and you can use it. So main thing is, this was also in the news in the recent times, even with the coming of Trump. Okay, there were certain red lipstick movements, and their lipstick is simply a tool. Okay, it symbolizes the revolt to the traditional patriarchal oppressive policies. Okay, so for example, this red lipstick movement, why is it trending, etc. Basically, protest against the Trump administration, or mainly kya, it is symbol of resistance and a hope. Okay, and main thing is, again, Trump's policies, his stance on gender identity, etc. has been criticized, and it brings and talks about the history of women rights. Fine. So overall, if you know the specifics, we can write still a better answer, and here then you bring in your thinkers. The moment I say red lipstick movement, I can again bring in personal is political. Can I say that? Okay. I can also talk about other thinkers, for example, Carol Hamish, Susan Morel Oken. I can bring in, say, Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. But jo theories and scholars you have already read, you have to weave it through your arguments here, because ultimately it's a movement. Movement ka kaam kya hoga? To raise voice, to raise collective consciousness, right? And in doing so, it will talk about the oppressive systems. It will talk about how a radical overhaul is needed, how it stands against as a symbol of resistance. All these points have to be highlighted when you write it. So, main cheez hai aapke liye, you know the arguments, fine. You know some scholars, you've done that in paper 1A, even in paper 2A. Ultimately, you have to bring them together in this. If you knew this specifically, of course, you could have written a better answer. But let's say nahi bhi yaad aa raha hai. ठीक है, ये question है. Still, how you well present your arguments is going to make a huge difference in this case. ठीक है. So already paper 1A में, in fact in paper 1B, you also read about women rights movements in India. So borrowing from that, it is a simple movement only. Let's say you don't exactly know. Basically here red lipstick is also used as the symbol, okay, of resistance and hope, main thing. Okay, so that is what we can talk about in this case. ठीक है, ऐसे कुछ articles हैं, symbol as power, liberation beyond beauty, because only this is seen to be that women, let's say, are used it only for, let's say, beauty purposes, etc. And again, it's a timeless symbol for resilience, rebellion, and unavoidable color. Okay, so some of these suffragette movements, etc. talked about it. Okay, so red lipstick goes back, there's a history to this. Main thing is how it brings together the women rights, gender justice. That is the whole component that we can talk about in this case. No, Karl Popper, when you mention it in his open societies. वो आप अगर आप, if you mention that in the context, it will not backfire. Okay, but if you are changing the timeline of this movement, then though it is not advisable. It is always better to write it overall, है ना? That this movement overall serves as an important reminder. So you use terminologies well. So Karl Popper में when you write it, write his book Open Society and Its Enemies. आप इसमें लिख सकते हो, you can bring in other thinkers also, let's say Hannah Arendt, but use it in the context. आप specify, you have to specify that with your writing. I hope that is clear. Right, हाँ. अभी this is actually a symbol of course when I said that, तो वो context of personal is political का, okay? The operation that happens inside the households is also universalized and talked about, but main चीज़ है, of course they are talking about their experiences, and they are basically saying that they are revolting against the traditional patriarchal practices. That is the core idea, okay? Okay, how many of you have understood till here, till the fifth question? यहाँ तक समझ में आ रहा है? देखो इस बार पेपर 2A में it was in many questions a lot of intellectual struggle. Okay, these topics we had done, but of course red lipstick nobody would have done. That is also true. Gender justice में सारी नई case studies सारे scholars पढ़े हैं, but not very specifically this movement. So again that is why I also showed you this paper, that paper 2A में the moment you see 2A and especially these sections of these sections, one will feel कि भाई this is difficult, because apart from P2B, other questions you have to write on the spot, right? Now, then the challenge comes, and because after speaking to many students, especially in paper 2 this time, most of the students have attempted questions from paper 2B, more questions. They have here chosen only one question because they had to. उसमें भी अब जो questions है, we'll also see the difficulty sometimes in a question, what makes a question more difficult, okay? Now, when you see the block of 2A, theme देखते हैं. पहली theme है democracy, democratic backlash, democratic backsliding. You can have some examples to support that. Fine, one. Second question है 15 marks का withdrawal of USA from WHO, far-reaching impacts. At second point का है reimagined WHO for global health agenda. Third is a question that we have exactly done in all of its detail. A question: transnational actors have qualitatively transformed the world by the way of fresh insights and actions. अब ये तीन सवाल है. अब आप कोई क्वेश्चन क्यों चूज करोगे when you know at least fair amount, right? But so here if you attempt इस क्वेश्चन में without mentioning examples, this question will become weak. Okay, so let's start now with this question now. ठीक है, उसके बाद of course we'll see these blocks one by one. Okay, now the world is currently seeing or being in the throes of a process, twin process है, democratic backsliding and democratic backlash. Now democracy is a topic. Okay, if I go back to our syllabus, if you see the last topic, contemporary global concerns. In fact, this video also on YouTube is also available for those who want to again see, right? Is democracy, एक यहाँ पे पढ़ते हो आप democracy, okay? Secondly, while also talking in paper 1, you also again read democracy, fine? Now the question is very peculiar. पहले in this question you have to mention the examples, ठीक है? World has facing twin process, दो चीजें हैं, एक है democratic backsliding and second is democratic backlash, fine? First you have to explain these two terms, second you have to give examples, third is how would you explain this paradox? But of course you cannot explain it, you will use some thinkers, their idea is to explain it, yes or no? And this part you can answer if you have followed the discussions well. Okay, I'll give you some examples how this can be answered. But main चीज है इसमें दोनों चीज का, the paradox has to be mentioned. What is backsliding? Democratic backsliding. हाँ हाँ, तो देखो backsliding में and then there is a backlash. See, two things are there. Two, and this is a paradox. In democratic backsliding, what we can say that democratic backsliding talks about how democracy in general is in danger. We've seen the rise of military coup. You can give that example, the rise of dictators. When I say military coup, you can talk about Myanmar. You can talk about how the issues happen in Bangladesh. Okay, you talk about the military coup, etc. in South Africa. And overall, the democratic institutions facing a challenge. Okay, इसी में there is a report. This report also we've done in the class. Economist Intelligence Unit की, the whole democracy index, etc. We've also written this. This is also facing challenges. In fact, I can also say the rise of demagogues and the far right leaders also increasing, which also presents a threat to democracy. So democratic backsliding is happening. So democratic process institutions are under threat. With examples you will explain. Fine. Democratic backlash, okay, is also that now the people are voicing their concerns, okay, about the decline of democracy. So there are popular protests, pro-democracy movements, and these movements are basically highlighting the democratic backsliding. So वो backlash आ रहा है. The government is also has been criticized by the people for the decline of democratic institutions. So दो चीजें चल रही हैं. Especially in aware societies, in citizenry, etc., in developed and developing, you see pro-democracy movements because people want democracy, people want empowerment. At the same time, in different parts of the world, you see a democratic backsliding decline. दो चीजें देख रहे हो. Pro-democracy movements भी देख रहे हैं हम, okay, which is the backlash, okay, democratic backlash. The people want democracy to be restored, institutions to be made stronger and better. At the same time, you also see democratic backsliding. ठीक? इस क्वेश्चन में of course this is the core crux and you have to support it via examples. First part, while doing so you can give the definition of democracy, but इस क्वेश्चन में मेन क्या है, सवाल का crux क्या है, word currently has been in the throes of twin process. तो पहली चीज तो ये कितने अच्छे से हम इसको एक्सप्लेन कर पाएंगे. The pro democracy movements which are happening, where would they happen? जहां पे एटलीस्ट कुछ सिस्टम्स जिंदा होंगे, yes or no, जहां पे इसलिए फाइट होगी. So these two processes are happening. अब question says, how would you explain this is happening? बताओ. अब इसी में you can give this and you can also support it through certain theories also. Okay, Larry Diamond. Okay, or let's say if you have read about Clash of Civilizations. Okay, Samuel P. Huntington, who also talks about 3 waves of democracy. First wave of democracy, second wave, and third wave. In the third wave, he says that there will be some people who will fight for democracy. Initially, democracy will rise, then it will slide, and again there will be a revival. In his book of Clash of Civilization, he also talks about that. Then, because how would you explain? You can create different theories to explain this. Okay? For example, एक book है, इसका gist आप पढ़ सकते हैं. I forgot to bring it today. There's a famous book, How Democracies Die. Books like Why Nations Fail, which again talk to you about the importance of institutions. So यहाँ पे you can use different theories to explain what explains the democratic या overall decline. You can use, बहुत हमने classes में देखा है, political decay, याद आ रहा है? Issues of political modernization and its challenges. The rise of overdeveloped state. So either from a Marxist analysis or from conventional cultural analysis, there can be different ways to explain how the backsliding is happening. What is political decay? Good point. Yes, Rohan, we can say that. Political decay का मैं आपको example देता हूँ. Slowly and steadily, political parties and their influence, is it decreasing? And people are going into more and more social movements. People are also sometimes seeing, so that also explains. And in social movements, they criticize the levels of democracy. There is a rise of other movements, human rights movements, civil rights movements, women rights movements, etc., which also says there is a discontent against the state. Okay, why is there a discontent? Because the states are not being democratic. एक और issue, why the democratic backsliding is also happening, the discontents because of globalization. I can also bring in the benefits या fruits of globalization. सब लोग को नहीं मिले. Not everybody has got those fruits. This has led to anger. This has led to xenophobia. This has led to protectionism. Ideas हैं हमारे पास, and all these ideas have certain scholars who have talked about it. So be it political decay, right? Be it rising protectionism can also be a threat to democracy. When a democracy है क्या? Everybody is equal. Everybody should have equal powers. But ultimately, फिर से बात करो, the rise of elites. This is what polyarchy, when it became deformed polyarchy, that power really does not lie with the people. Then Farid Zakaria says the rise of illiberal democracies. कितनी बार लिखा है हमने क्लास में? We had written Francis Fukuyama, end of history, ideological point. Democracy is the best. And remember, we wrote Robert Kagan, return of history. या end of history को हमने change किया था. Yes or no? Yes. तो इस question में you will have a lot of, I have mentioned a lot of scholars here. Robert Kagan, Francis Fukuyama, Samuel P. Huntington, political decay, political modernization, बहुत theories हैं आप जिसको use कर सकते हो इस question को explain करने के लिए. But just that you have to explain these two concepts fairly well. I hope we are clear on this. तो इसमें it will depend. Somebody can start with Francis Fukuyama and then explain it through ideology and democracy also. That's also a good point. But this question is 20 marker. That means whatever examples you give, इसका second part strong होना चाहिए. How would you explain this paradox? ठीक है, तो Farid Zakaria, for example, the rise of illiberal democracies. I can also link it to decline of democracy even in US. The attack on US Capitol, the attacks on blacks, etc. That is also not very democratic. Okay. I think this will substantially explain our points. Okay. Chalo. Democratic backlash in South Asia. Okay. In fact, in India also we have seen the challenge of democratic institutions. Democratic backsliding, to Indian Express mein, Hindu mein, you will see articles along this, right? And isme again, the point is, if you've read their newspapers, fair, but ye questions, agar aapne basic bhi understanding GS की कर रखी है, and you know the scholars and theories of 2A, you can write a very good answer. Okay? In fact, is pe to one more dimension they could have asked you, the debate between democracy and development. The whole debate between Lee Kuan Yew and Amartya Sen. Okay? Democratic backslash in even South Asia. Question was not for South Asia. You could have written global examples here also. Fine? That is why I spent more time. This is a question somebody would have been challenged. Okay? But still, let's see this. Now, विड्रॉल ऑफ यूएसए, इस बार क्या पूछा WHO, अगले साल क्या पूछ सकते हैं, पेरिस एग्रीमेंट, यस। अगली बार क्या पूछ सकते हैं, यूएसए's विड्रॉल और हाउ इज यूएसए वीकनिंग UNHRC, यूएसए वीकनिंग WTO, समझ रहे हो क्वेश्चन? Is this question also not related to multilateral world order? It is. Institutions, it is. However, they have, so first is, it will have far-reaching impacts on the global health, right? Because see, funding का issue होगा, okay? And second is, reimagining the existing WHO is vital for global health agenda. क्यों? क्योंकि even WHO did not imagine threats like pandemic. And even in that time, there was a huge alleged interference of China. They were very biased against China. They did not name it the Wuhan virus. Fine. This also shows to us the global leadership crisis. USA could not do much. China wanted to have its own influence. So what will happen? The people will suffer if if WHO does not timely declare a pandemic, does not timely declare vaccines, does not timely declare information on health. Who is at loss? All the people are at loss. Yes or no? So the very first question is withdrawal of USA. अब इस question में withdrawal of USA will have far-reaching impacts on global health. Start with, you can talk about how USA's influence overall is also declining. USA is going for America first approach. In that sense, when you say MAGA, making America great again, how USA does not care much now about the international liberal order, multilateral order, which is very different from 1947 or the World War II. पहले तो यूएसए सबसे बड़ा supporter of all the multilateral order was, yes or no? And why would it have far-reaching impacts? We will tell about issue of representation, issue of funds, issue of autonomy, issue of increasing Chinese influence, right or not? तो इस क्वेश्चन में पहले, when you write and attempt it later on, first think on the broad points. How will USA impact be? And look this question also from the lens of strategic rivalry. While yes, an institution is getting weak, but about their representation of the members who are there in the WHO, how will they be able to do research and development, how much capacity building, how much fund allocation, and then alleged Chinese interference. If USA moves out, what would happen? How can we reimagine WHO with proper countries' influence? And how can WHO be better prepared for future pandemics, for future non-traditional security threats? अब लिंक कर सकते हो पहले से, क्योंकि अभी you can also anticipate the future of bioterrorism. Microorganisms can also be used. Yes or no? दूसरा, इस क्वेश्चन में एक और चैलेंज है ग्लोबलाइजेशन का. ग्लोबलाइजेशन लीड्स टू प्रॉब्लम विदाउट पासपोर्ट्स. कितने लोग को आप ट्रैक करोगे? हाउ मेनी वैक्सीन्स विल यू ट्रैक एंड डिप्लॉय एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा? हाउ विल यू ब्रिंग दिस टुगेदर? इन फैक्ट, व्हेन there was a call for global vaccine development, there was a call for waiver, but later on even WTO could not actually do it in very proper manner. Yes or no? So you have to reimagine. It means current challenges and new range of challenges and bringing in developed versus developing, because how to imagine this in the backdrop of global south, this also is an important concern. Can we say this? Right? So ये points हमें लिखने पड़ेंगे. This is what you can write here in this case. Okay, so I hope we have been able to address and understand some of these points, right? Same here points. US withdrawal from WHO, global threat, again in article of 2025. You'll see this, okay, Hindu mein, etc. US exit from WHO, a chance to reshape a global health. Okay, अब देखो, इसमें just, if you see the heading here, it's time for countries in the global south to support WHO. किसकी बात हो रही है? देखो, global south. So one thing extra I will also write. हमने कुछ और points देखे यहाँ पे. One also is examples plus theories. You know theories also, sometimes you know examples. जितने अच्छे से इनको लिंक करोगे, the better marks you will get. Okay. Third, wherever possible, look into the strategic rivalry. Let's say USA, China, USA, Russia, etc., etc. And in that you can carve out a space also for global south, sometimes indirectly also. Okay, तो जितनी भी एडवाइस या टेकअवेज हैं इनको कहीं पे हम लिखते भी रहेंगे, and whatever things I'm telling, maybe I'm not be able to write everything here, but all the micro points I'm telling you. कि क्वेश्चंस में ना हमें मतलब we have to extract everything that we can from the question paper, okay, and then again prepare in the best possible manner, right? Okay. India के example देखो, this question is broad in nature. You can also bring the Indian perspective here for in one small paragraph, okay? And नहीं अगर ला रहे हो इंडिया का तो ग्लोबल साउथ ले लो, उसमें इंडिया की लीडरशिप की बात करो. इसलिए when you see this article of the Hindu, properly एक opinion editorial है, the same thing they are also talking about. How global south has to be reimagined. So global south is a dimension you can again talk about. ठीक है? Okay, बहुत हैं articles, WHO on the USA leaving this, okay? Right? But this kind of specificity was not imagined directly. If the examiner is asking you, use your basic common sense and knowledge, weave the points and then argue your case. इतनी चीजें आप सोच सकते हैं because they can keep on changing the body. कितनी bodies करोगे आप? UNHRC हो सकती है. It can be WTO. We had done WTO by the way in the class also, right? We had done other bodies, but this one we had not specifically done. Okay, of course it was covered, but this also tells us if the weakness of any multilateral organization or that is in news, we can also prepare that. Okay, although the same question on WHO was asked in GS2 some years back. अगर आप GS2 मेंस में देखोगे, in IR they had asked you this question. Okay, Trump signs executive order to withdraw. Okay, so WHO ripped us off. Not going to happen. Trump will always look at these things that it is a huge financial burden, security burden, and he will say, let's move away. Okay, fine. Now, this is a relatively easy question. Those who have prepared their topic well. Okay, transnational actors, I'll directly tell you. फिर से हम syllabus पे आते हैं. Okay, so when we again cover, साफ साफ देखो, ये मुझे साफ syllabus में दिख रहा है. Can I see this? Transnational actors, direct question. अब ये question देखो, paper is already tough. The questions which are direct, can I leave them? I cannot leave them at all. This is a direct question, extensively with all the dimensions also done in the class. Okay, so again for the relatively easier questions, I'll not be spending too much time, but I'll give you a broad overview. Transnational actors have qualitatively transformed the world by the way of fresh insights and actions. Illustrate your answer with suitable examples. Okay, अब जब भी आप ट्रांसनेशनल एक्टर्स की बात करते हो, okay, they have qualitatively transformed the world. Broadly speaking, you have to talk about MNCs, TNCs, multinational companies, corporations, transnational corporations. You can talk about a lot of NGOs, which can also be transnational actors. Fine. Many times the students can only write about this. That is not a very good answer. Fine. These are also why transnational actors. Another last dimension you can also explore is this. Maybe you miss while writing it. This can be Islamic State, etc. These are also transnational actors. They have transformed the world. Okay, and which is why new threats are also emerging. So इस question में सिर्फ ये नहीं लिखना है अपने को. Okay, so when we do this, we also cover all these areas. Now, when we analyze it, in my classes also I've told you, we will analyze it through the neo-liberal perspective, which means Robert Kyoham and Joseph Nye, complex interdependence, how these MNCs, etc. help in transformation, economic development, etc. But you have to bring in the Marxist critique, that these also lead to development of underdevelopment. Immanuel Wallerstein, okay, all these theories. And sometimes MNCs are equally as exploitative as the state, and sometimes they become the instrument of the state, the instrument of the capitalist class, right? And we have written the quote also, that in the search of profits, they nestle everywhere and settle everywhere. So my point is, you will talk about these, but additionally from a theoretical angle, I can bring in the liberal, neoliberal perspective, I can also bring in the Marxist perspective. If possible, I can also bring in the feminist perspective here. Right, that how MNCs and TNCs have led to worsening quality of women. MNCs in Bangladesh, etc., those who bring in poor quality of life for workers. Everybody has to overwork. Similarly for NGOs and similarly for terrorists. But these are transnational actors. No, not necessary. Not necessary. You don't only have to mention the positives. When you mention the positives, later on, mention this also. ये point आप add कर देना. हाँ. Good point. Techno capitalism में यहाँ पे ले आऊँगा. And the rise of surveillance states supported by the MNCs, FANG companies. Okay, yes, good point. Techno, ये भी हमने करा है. We have spoken about the techno capitalism. Susan Strange, इनके नाम भी पढ़े हमने. ठीक है? So this is a good question. I think you would have had a lot of insights. बहुत अच्छे example लिख सकते हो इसमें. How Apple, and even you can give examples of Africa, how big MNCs call all the shots in this case. Okay? ठीक है. तो rise of non-state actors in 20th and 21st century. Okay, ऐसे बहुत articles हैं. Proper आपके notes पे भी होना चाहिए. In our crash course we've done this extensively well. Okay? Powerful force, and this also tells you the moment non-state actors, the transnational actors increase, it also means a realist conception of purely state actors is changing. Realist conception is changing, ठीक है? So non-state actors raise concern about legitimacy, etc., interference, okay? International NGOs and perils of outsourcing development. क्या दिक्कत होगी? That NGOs sometimes, when the development happens, many a times this can also be. Sometimes NGOs are criticized for furthering somebody's agenda. They may not be development centric, but sometimes they give the impression they are development centric. They can also be extractive. Okay? So Vivek Dev Roy, Sanjeev Sanyal, okay? Some of the articles, Western NGOs, etc., some of the challenges, international economic order. Okay, how the transnational actors must also be included is also one important point we can talk about. Okay? So I hope people here have been able to gather some points. Okay, that was block number 2. Now, another interesting question. Okay, of late centrist and center left parties have been facing setbacks. Okay, important है इसको भी बताना. While center right parties have been in ascendancy the world over. अब कुछ points इस question के and question 2A will overlap. Right, and we will see how. जैसे कि centrist है, ये center left parties है, political parties हैं, they are receding and this is happening around the world. And you see, ये हमने, this question we've also done in fascism, this question we've also done in the rise of the other far right groups in paper 2A in not one but at least 2 different places. And I've given you extensively examples like Marine Le Pen, Julian Bolsonaro, okay, AFD, all at least 5 or 6 parties we have written, how the rise of center right is happening. Okay, the center right parties are increasing. And the reason for the rise of center right parties is, अब हम इसके कुछ points देखते हैं. जैसे कि आप मुझे बताओ, why are center right parties increasing? ऐसा क्या हो रहा है which makes some of the parties increase? What is so special about these parties, which is why they are, let's say, increasing? Migrant crisis, you're saying? Good point. और कुछ? That's a good point. Unemployment और कुछ? Very good. इन्हीं points को, and because of these points we'll also say, so let's say, what explains the rise of, let's say, the parties of far right, ठीक है? Or we can say the growing populism, etc. What explains that? So कुछ points है, जैसे there is a rise of xenophobia, okay? There is the discontent due to globalization, right? अब of course हर एक point के लिए, इसके लिए भी Joseph Stiglitz, relevant scholars we can quote. I'm just first telling you some of the points, okay? The issues, because of this, it has led to identity politics. अब आप सोचो, जैसे for example, even Trump will cater to a section of people. He will talk about remove all the, let's say, the refugees, etc. So refugee crisis is also one reason. And when I say discontent from globalization, this in itself is a big point. The discontent can be also because of rising inequalities, lack of employment, lack of jobs going to outsiders. So there is also a backlash against outsiders. And what are the far right parties saying? They will talk about economic protectionism, economic nationalism, right? So all these points I can derive from here, and many thinkers have talked about this, right? So इससे हो क्या रहा है? Because of the economic nationalism or protectionism, the problem is these properties are becoming, okay? So there is a rise of populism because of this, right? Of course they focus on hyper pseudo nationalism, and this is very much visible even in Brazil, Julian Bolsonaro. This is visible in other areas, जैसे कि which areas? Europe में तो very much visible throughout, be it France, ओके, इवन इन जर्मनी विक्टर ओरबान, ओके, बहुत मैंने अराउंड 8 से 9 ऐसे एग्जाम्पल लिखे हैं क्लासेस में. यस, right, similar such policies in America, even MAGA policies have this element of huge populism, and some of this part we can say that. So how to explain that, and which also tells you the democratic backsliding, the rise of authoritarian strong leaders which you see in these far right parties. In fact, when the question was, and when we had wanted to discuss for ourselves that what, for example, explains, okay, that whether do you have the rise of fascist tendencies in the 21st century, I gave you similar points only. The rise of far right parties and how these far right parties can actually lead to these problems. Can we say this also? ठीक है, तो again identity politics है. Okay, I can also talk about cultural nationalism, revival of cultural nationalism. ठीक है, सारे पॉइंट्स आ जाएंगे यहां पे हमारे. मेक सेंस? तो दिस इज जस्ट वन पॉइंट विच आई हैव टोल्ड यू. ओके, एंड इसमें जस्ट अ कपल ऑफ एग्जांपल्स यू कैन राइट. डिक्लाइन ऑफ सेंटर लेफ्ट में जस्ट अ कपल ऑफ एग्जांपल्स, सम एडिशनल पॉइंट्स आई एम टेलिंग यू. सेंटर लेफ्ट में वी कैन राइट फ्रेंच सोशलिस्ट्स मार्जिनलाइज्ड. दूसरा, यूएस में डेमोक्रेट्स लेबल्ड एज अर्बन एलीट, तो देयर इज ऑल्सो बैकलैश अगेंस्ट देम. तो डेमोक्रेट्स लूजिंग रेलेवेंस. फ्रांस में, जर्मनी में देयर इज अ पार्टी एसपीडी दैट इज गेटिंग वीक. ओके, एंड इसका उल्टा क्या है, जैसे द रिपब्लिकन्स फॉर एग्जांपल आर बिकमिंग वेरी पॉपुलर इन द यूएस. ट्रंप हैज वेरी पॉपुलर पॉलिसीज. ओके, इन इटली ऑल्सो वी हैव द रिवाइवल ऑफ द राइट पार्टीज. ओके, इन जर्मनी ऑल्सो द रिवाइवल ऑफ राइट पार्टीज. वी कैन गिव मेनी एग्जांपल्स फॉर दैट. तो दैट इज वन. तो इसमें जस्ट अ स्मॉल होमवर्क आई वुड वांट, एग्जांपल्स ऑफ सेंट्रिस्ट एंड सेंटर लेफ्ट पार्टीज एक अलग से लिखना. ठीक है, और इसको द सेंटर राइट पार्टीज एटलीस्ट 6 or 7 एग्जांपल्स यू राइट देम. फायदा क्या होगा अगर नेक्स्ट सवाल आया, डू यू सी द राइज ऑफ अथॉरिटेरियन या फैसिस्ट टेंडेंसीज इन 21st century, you can say yes, there is some resemblance. Again you will use the same content, right? This question I also teach you in paper 1A and I also teach you in 1B, because 1A में अगर question आया in the ideology of fascism, is fascism dead, I will again use some of this content, that there happens to be some elements of fascism in the current parties, in some parties. I can talk and give their examples. तो आप देखो कंटेंट यूज कैसे करना है हमें. यस और नो? वी कैन टॉक अबाउट दैट नाउ. चलो, इंडियन बेस्ड आर्टिकल्स हैं, फार राइट, यूरोपियन पार्लियामेंट, काफी ऐसे आर्टिकल्स हैं विच वन कैन रीड, कैसे एट्रीब्यूटेड है. समटाइम्स यू विल गेट सम ऑफ दीज आर्टिकल्स. सो स्टूडेंट्स ऑफ पॉलिटिकल साइंस, बहुत बार क्या होता है, सम इन्फॉर्मेटिव आर्टिकल्स ऑन पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज, यू सिंपली थिंक अरे नहीं पॉलिटिक्स है, पॉलिटिक्स है, पॉलिटिक्स है. देखो 20 मार्कर का सवाल आया है. ठीक है, तो इसमें इट इज बेटर. इन पेपर 1B दिस ईयर दे डिड नॉट आस्क यू दिस स्पेसिफिक क्वेश्चन, बट इन 2A दे हैव आस्क्ड यू. Yes? Okay, the European right, etc., some of the articles in the recent times. Okay, now, collective security and R2P are neither uniform in scope, goals or methods. Fine? So this also, when you say, अगर आप फिर से syllabus को देखते हो अपने, is collective security mentioned directly? Yes. Responsibility to protect has been used or sometimes, so for this can be a slightly traditional topic. By the way, this was in news. Okay, the limits of international law, the responsibility to protect Israel and the International Court of Justice, ICJ was also in news, even this. But normally when you read collective security etc, दो terms आप पढ़ते हो. One is collective security and one is collective defense. Collective defense you read in the context of NATO, and then you have collective security, that if there is a country which is having a threat, should you help it out, should you invade, should you have boots on the ground. That is the main context here, right? तो इसी में क्वेश्चन क्या कह रहा है, this is, they are uniform neither in scope, ना ही goals में और ना ही methods में, which means around the world they have had different points which we can talk about, right? तो क्यों नहीं है uniform? Because during Cold War the word was different. Post Cold War, so this is also a framework you can use. कुछ नहीं समझ में आए, during and post कर दो World War, Cold War. Even then the shifting alliances they would have changed. Post Cold War, what is the change that is happening? ये बताओ, इससे आंसर हो जाएगा आपका ये बहुत आसानी से. Post Cold War, there is a rise of non-state actors, there is a rise of non-traditional threats, there is also a rise of proxy wars. Yes or no? What is also changing post Cold War? Now there is a rise of drones, the warfare, hybrid warfare is coming in. So conventional notions of security is also changing. Even this can also be said. और क्या कह सकते हो इसमें? देखो, Syria, Libya, Russia, Ukraine, all of this also shows to you the limitations of collective security and R2P. So you also have to talk about how the world order is changing, number one, but at the same time you have to give examples that how these examples, because see, right now also there is a conflict going on. So where is the responsibility to protect? Middle East, dekh lo aap, right? The regions around Middle East which faced a crisis, or the other regions, we are still under crisis. That is the main challenge. Can we say this? So how you differentiate your answers? So one is a framework during, or let's say post Cold War, and second, of course, you will write about how things are changing, and last May, you can bring in various examples to show the limitations of the R2P, which is also why it is criticized. Even R2P can also be politicized in that sense. There is the freedom of operation is very limited in this case. If I say Israel, you also know there is a huge, USA will directly or indirectly support Israel. USA moved out of some of the Human Rights Council and let's say the UNESCO because of anti-Israel bias. So, isko operationalize karna, be it in scope, how far or how narrow. अब क्या होता जा रहा है? The scope is getting narrower. No country wants their sovereignty to be taken away. By fight चल रही है. They will say, "Bhai, this is our own matter. Why are you intervening?" Yes or no? So this becomes a very delicate matter. Second, it has a very limited relevance. By UN right now is not able to control a lot of kinetic and non-kinetic conflicts. So this also adds to that. Okay? But that also said, this again is a very broad question, which also tells you that you have to be updated of what is happening around the world. One more takeaway which I also see, which I can also add now, for example, is you should be aware about overall certain important political parties around the world with some leaders' name. You also should know proper conflicts around the world, at least names, nomenclature you should be aware about. Normally this is expected, but again I'm just writing, somebody who's a beginner, you still want to have better understanding, you can still do this better. Okay? So this is one. Now, this is a very good question. If you've read the topic of globalization, you will understand the sentiment. The global south sensitive model of globalization would prevent the dangers emanating from over-centralized globalization. Now, globalization is directly mentioned in our syllabus. This is topic number 4. अब इस क्वेश्चन में लिंक क्या किया इन्होंने? They have linked this to global south. Okay, जैसे global south sensitive model of globalization, Dr. S. Jaishankar, right? In fact, the people online, some of the slides that I'm saying, you can just keep writing down these headings, and after the class, whenever you find time, you can look into it. Rohan, which question are we talking about? Is it the previous one? Otherwise, I'll also open the PDF file also with me, then we can also have a look at. You can just drop that comment. Let me just first discuss this, then I'll come back. Okay. नहीं तो चलो, let me just open the main PDF. From that, there will be no confusion if that is the case. चलो यहाँ से देख लेते हैं. अच्छा, they've been facing setbacks, so if that is the case, so okay, we can see that. Chalo, global south sensitive model of globalization would prevent the dangers emanating from over centralized globalization. What is the core essence of this question? Simple सोचो, देखो जो globalization है current in the current terms, is it leading to more inequalities? Yes. Is it very good for the global south? Not really. Here, if I use the Marxist perspective, the Marxists say that it is leading to development of underdevelopment. The core and the periphery model, word systems theory, Immanuel Wallerstein. Yes. The question says a global south sensitive model of globalization would prevent the dangers emanating from over centralized globalization. इस question में there are some themes, just you can think about them and note them. जैसे मैं बोल रहा हूँ issues. So with globalization, the major issues are, of course, globalization has led to inequalities. Globalization has led to discontents. These two are strong Marxist critiques on globalization. Right? If I talk about the case of Global South, I can bring this point again, okay? That again, be it Emmanuel Wallerstein, Thomas Piketty, all of them highlight this properly. But iske bhi beyond, there are certain points. जैसे कि, for example, in Global South, again, the case of Africa, the exploitation of Africa, okay, the exploitation of recently developed colonies, and the bigger issue that is there is neo-colonialism, which the Global South is facing, okay. Additionally, when I say globalization, I can also bring in a couple of other dimensions. If you see WTO, if you see IMF, if you see World Bank, these are highly in the favor of global north. To challenge them, that is why we see the rise of BRICS, we see the rise of de-dollarization, which aims to make this what? More democratic, okay. The BRICS in the recent 17th or even the 18th BRICS summit, it spoke about South-South cooperation. It spoke about de-dollarization. You can give examples. And BRICS also creates a new development bank. BRICS creates contingency reserve arrangements. क्या फायदा होगा उसका? You will again have a very strong case for South-South cooperation. So question simply says that the current model of globalization is over-centralized. It is still in the hands of elites, in the hands of corporates, in the hands of West. That must be tackled and that must be challenged. So if you have read, in fact, those who had done the last class, in fact, वो last class which I YouTube पे है around 6.5 hours, I've done in detail BRICS and the two recent summits of BRICS. Okay. In the last summit, I told you the one in which Jaishankar and in fact PM Modi had attended it, but Chinese and the Russian counterparts, they did not. In that, there's a huge case to be made for South-South cooperation. So while the question is not on BRICS, but I can bring BRICS in the question as well. This is your creativity. This is how you lace your arguments. So if you have done, in fact, last year क्या सवाल आया था? Deglobalization पे सवाल आया last year. अब उसमें नया term ढूंढा. So do you also see Global South as a dimension? Again, yes or no? So Global South पे सवाल आ रहा है बार-बार आपको, पूछ रहे हैं वो आपसे, ठीक है? So this is something you can prepare. And this is a very good question, in fact, what has been asked. So one should again see this. Now, we have other questions. For example, now this block is highly current affairs oriented. पूरा का पूरा block. पहला question है Latin America. Normally you read Latin America in the case of India and Latin America, that is Indian Global South in paper 2B. Latin America has made moderate success in US-led economic order by forming various organizations emphasizing regional sovereignty, etc., etc. Okay, and alternative regional security, sovereignty, economic integration, and alternate development. ठीक है. In this question, when we see this, ठीक है, if you find time, you can again read and go back. Okay, case for this model of globalization. Our question is now this. देखो, Latin America, in our syllabus we have a topic of NAFTA, and of course now we read about USMCA. With the coming of Trump and the US-led order, there is a proper tussle that is going on, because NAFTA was the free trade agreement. Okay, you have US, Canada, Mexico again having an agreement here. Abhi issue kya hai? Latin America is facing its challenges. Okay, in terms of that USA does not want to give them a very fair trade deal. Trump had simply said that NAFTA was the worst trade deal in the world. Okay, is question mein aap ye bhi dekho, Latin America has made moderate success. It means one, it has tried to negotiate itself, fine. it has also tried to look for alternate avenues. Latin America's outreach to India, to other countries, even let's say China. So this question, Colombia joins let's say BRI as China courts Latin America. तो ये क्वेश्चन अगर कोई क्वेश्चन यूएस का है डायरेक्ट, यू हैव टू ब्रिंग इन स्ट्रैटेजिक राइवलरी. दैट इज व्हाई आई रोट दिस पॉइंट. ये आपको दिख रहा है स्ट्रैटेजिक राइवलरी. सो हियर अगेन द एक्शंस ऑफ यूएस चाइना, you will bring this dimension even if this is not explicit. Okay, China has surpassed USA as the biggest trading partner, Brazil, Peru, Chile, other Latin American nations. Okay, so in this question का एक बार देखो फिर से, the scope of the question, countering US led global economic order. So already we know there were challenges in NAFTA. NAFTA was scrapped. This gave way to USMCA, then USMCA 2.0. और रीजनल सॉवरेनिटी होनी चाहिए. सो अल्टीमेटली इट इज अबाउट ट्रेड डील्स, ब्लॉक्स लाइक मर्कोसुर. ओके, इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन विच अगेन देखो, अगर आपके पास ट्रेड डील्स है, राइट नाउ यू सी द डिक्लाइन ऑफ WTO एंड द राइज ऑफ मिनीलेटरलिज्म. small blocks are getting created, right? And other countries, for example, India is very much interested in Latin America. We see that. So some content of Latin America and India that we've done extensively in the class can also be brought to this, right? Earlier it was said it was something is out of sight, out of mind, but now our outreach to them is increasing. We can also talk about that, right? And last is alternate development. Yahan pe aa jayega, Chinese angle, BRI, right? So of course I can understand some of you may have found it difficult because normally 20 markers on Latin America nobody expects. To write 4 pages here is difficult, but if you've done Latin America and Global South properly there, and if you've done this topic of 2A, ये जो challenges थे ये हमने class में सारे argument के साथ बहुत detail में, why the issue was there, why this was renegotiated, this we have done. If you combine them, then you can write a very good answer. Because this question again is going to be highly difficult. So those who are attempting it, in fact some of the students who have done this, you could have utilized this whole thing and points. ठीक है, all right. India can have Latin America movement, ongoing US-China trade war. और इस क्वेश्चन में एक और चीज है, very good point. We have to also bring in the tariffs and the trade war. The tariffs and trade war and the uncertainty of US foreign policy also opens strategic space for India. तो इस क्वेश्चन में India explicit कहीं नहीं लिखा, पर alternate case में you will bring in India, you will bring in China. Can we do that? That is how you will write some of these questions, which in case if you have to attempt, this shall be the way forward. Okay. Now, some of these questions, which also means new kind of questions coming in. Now, how successful has ASEAN +3 been in addressing regional problem support? Now, ASEAN is a topic you read both in 2A and 2B. In 2B, in the topic of regionalization of world politics, we read ASEAN. And second, India-ASEAN also you read, when you read India's Look East policy, you also read about ASEAN. Very recently, in our classes, we had done the ASEAN overall broad summit, India-ASEAN summit, okay, the declaration, Modi ji's 10 principles, the 10 guiding principles. But examiner has asked you something which has happened way back, the ASEAN +3. So this is a combination of China, okay, you have Japan and South Korea, and predominantly they are collaborating also in the economic domain. And one of the best examples of what they had done is ultimately the fruitful negotiations of Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, okay, RCEP. Initially RCEP was supposed to be ASEAN +6, which included India, but of course later on India moved out, so it became 6 ban gaya 5. In that even they had a prominent role, but other than that, question tha, how successful they have been. Question agar hai how successful, you will write both cases, positive and negative. Positive in the sense, और इसमें देखो क्वेश्चन अभी मुश्किल लग रहा है, but आप on the spot अभी if you brainstorm with me, you will be able to generate points. Positive कैसे? They were helpful because see they will do negotiations, they will have proper trade deals, okay, they will talk about liberalization. So ultimately this led to RCEP. That was a good part. But what was the negative part? The negative part was China itself. On the economic front they were doing well, but there were still territorial disputes. In South China Sea, in East China Sea, there was again, South China Sea we know, 9-line. Okay, China's claims on sovereignty. Second, China is very aggressive in its dumping. So while there is a trade deal, China will aggressively dump its materials. Okay, So there is always a case of China, and again a lot of these, China does not open its markets entirely, but it can dump in others market. तो सबसे बड़ा challenge ASEAN plus 3 में था China, and many states have within ASEAN very ambivalent position on China. In fact, if you remember, we've done ASEAN में हमने quote किया किशोर महबूबानी को, okay, Jeffrey SNG, who have mentioned ASEAN centrality is a key pillar for India, and always remember ASEAN members and how they operate with China will define the future of China, will define the future of ASEAN. So that is what, तो regional problems में भी issue क्या है? Issue of Indo-Pacific, the shared concerns of security, because China is a huge actor in that sense. So while China is active militarily, but militarily, security wise, it is also a threat. तो कुछ limitation, मतलब कुछ achievements भी हैं, but equally challenges भी लिखने हैं, ठीक है? But nonetheless, of course, this will be a slightly difficult question in the exam hall. क्योंकि if the question was ASEAN or India, etc., you would have written more. But here it is more specific in nature, right? Okay, so India ASEAN, तो चलो ये तो there. अब इसमें you can still last में bring in the India angle, but that is different from ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus 3 directly does not include India. Okay. ASEAN of course was in the news because of the recent summits. We had already done these summits in detail, but of course क्या है, question summit से direct नहीं आया, question उसके beyond आया. Okay. Again, an important theme this year is Donald Trump. लग रहा है पेपर ही एक नया टॉपिक बनाना चाहिए हमें, है ना? Donald Trump. Now, Trump's return to White House is a jolt to push EU to invest in its own defense and economic and technological revival. अब देखो, the moment Trump comes in, you will get tariffs, you will get transactional diplomacies, and he will always have a U-turn. अभी भी right now, he has slapped India with 25 plus 25, 50% tariffs. Yes or no? So here, of course, अब ये case क्या बन रहा है? EU is also a topic you read in regionalization of world politics. This time, ये पूरा का पूरा जो block है हमारा, right? The very first question, for example, etc. But if you see this block, regionalization of world politics, EU पे question है, ASEAN पे question है, ठीक है? NAFTA पे direct नहीं, but a question is on Latin America. Yes or no? So entire block has been asked. APEC पे of course नहीं है, although in our class we had also seen the Bogor goals and the recent Putrajaya vision, etc., etc. ये एक important block फिर से बन जाता है. और why this block became important? Because of the recent terms. This block is highly current affairs oriented. Regionalization of world politics. Yes or no? इस पे सवाल पूछा है हमसे सीधा. Okay. So this is also one thing that we can talk about. So Trump's return to the White House is a jolt to push the EU to invest in its own defense. Dimensions देखेंगे. Defense, economic, and technological revival. Now, one thing I'll also say, many times the phrasing of the questions tells you the dimensions you have to think about. Okay? So that is also one thing I would ask. जो points लिख रहे हैं, जो phrasing है हमारे questions की, उससे you see the dimensions also. So sometimes when you have to write the answer, अगर अब क्वेश्चन सीधा ऐसे होता, एनालाइज द ट्रम्प्स पॉलिसीज एंड हाउ डज इट इफेक्ट्स EU स्टेबिलिटी. अब मुझे तीन चीजें पहले से पता, आई कैन राइट ऑन डिफेंस, आई कैन राइट ऑन इकोनॉमिक, एंड आई कैन राइट ऑन टेक्नोलॉजिकल रिव्यू. फाइन. सो दोज हु हैव डन EU in regionalization, you will have some content available, plus India EU you would have also known. उसमें ट्रम्प के एंगल के साथ you have to analyze it. Again a question which will again require some analytical thinking. Fine, but this is a topic you do both ways. In our classes also we've done in 2A also, we've done this in 2B also. Fine. In one of the threads we have seen Trump, but to imagine that 15 Markle will come on Trump and EU is again a point you have to navigate and you have to write in this case. ठीक है? Okay, defense startups में ऐसी बहुत articles हैं इधर उधर, right? Investments in European defense startup firms, etc., etc. So you will see some of these points here by. So one is of course defense, economic sense में again फिर से how BRI is there. Also talk about EU is already facing the challenge of Russia-Ukraine conflict. Some of that will spill over to other areas also, right? Then there's also rise of populist leaders also, right? Economic sense में there is economic nationalism on the rise. EU has just seen Brexit, okay? So EU is also facing challenges in terms of movements of people, etc., which also raises concern. Non-traditional security threats would also increase, and technological review. So here also collaborations are happening, etc. So this you have to also analyze US and EU as a strategic viewpoint. We've also seen the criticism of EU in the sense EU is mostly an economic bloc. They do not value security in that sense like USA or other country does. So that can also be mentioned here, how EU can improve its security calculations and security calculus. Okay. Fine. Now we move on to paper 2B. Last के जो कुछ questions हैं हमारे, ठीक है? Till here are we able to follow? Okay. Now here also you will see almost major questions will have a huge bearing. So एक और चीज हमने देखी, almost the major sections which were added, ये तो हमने देखे यहाँ पे for paper 2A. But there is a huge bearing of current affairs we cannot ignore. Now, normally people believe that PSIR का paper 2B is current affairs and 2A तो static होता है. But do you see the current affairs elements? If I want to again pin a percentage, I would say more than 70 or 80% questions are current affairs linked. So whatever topics you have seen in the syllabus for 2A, and the last topics, at least from 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, all these topics have an element of current affairs. So when you now prepare, whatever is happening, link it to the theories that you've already done, static आप पढ़ चुके हो, उसको current से link करो, and that you have to integrate, right? We do that in the classes also, the crash course also, but still, if somebody wants to do it at their own, a very simple advice from my side is read any single newspaper. You don't have to do it daily. हो सकता है weekly पढ़ो. Weekly, every week, 1 or 2 or 3 good articles on PSIR will be there. Keep a track of it, as simple as that. कहीं पे diary पे बस लिखते रहो, अच्छा, EU and this event happened, and you know this article happened, right? So after you're done with the pre, if you have a habit, read it, but after the pre also you'll have a repository of some very good articles, okay? That is how I also keep a track. मैं भी यही करता हूँ एक तरह से, okay? I read some periodicals, some magazines, and of course because I have to read slightly more, okay? That is one. Now, same thing we'll also do for paper 2B, and paper 2B में people are aligned. They already know this is going to be current affairs oriented. Fine. So if somebody has only gone through only static notes, you may face a challenge. क्योंकि अब सवाल आपको push करेंगे यहाँ पे, ठीक है? So here we'll go. The questions which are on expected lines, I'll just give you an overview, okay? Because we cannot, I think there's also some paucity of time, so some of the questions I'll give you an overview, but for the other questions I'll also try to, let's say, discuss. Now, one by one. Pehla question. China's growing footprint and a tangible shift in the power dynamics in Bangladesh has weakened India's leverage in Dhaka, okay? Of course, whenever we do India's neighborhood, I start by the China and its influence across its neighbors. In this question, you have to talk about, okay, not only in terms of China's growing influence in Chinese BRI, okay, you also have to talk about the recent political upheaval that has happened. The moment a country becomes regionally unstable, politically unstable, that also increases the scope for more and more intervention. Can we say that? Yes? Even this is a challenge in case of this. So China's growing influence or footprint, when you link this question, think of location of Bangladesh, okay, very close to India's chicken's neck. Second, also very close to India's northeast. So for India's neighborhood first policy, for India's act east policy, the growing influence, and of course the regimes, for example, there have been regimes, जैसे पहले थी Awami League, okay, and the moment party changes, this we've seen in March, you have to highlight, okay, while talking about India's footprint, while talking about India's support in 1971 liberation war, okay, support to, and again a lot of cooperation between India and Bangladesh, okay, on the economic front, on the strategic front, even on the cultural front as well. So you have to balance that. Yes, China's influence is increasing, but Indian influence, and because India does not have to be a big brother right now, we don't have to meddle in their political affairs, but we have to help them in democratic rebalancing. Okay, so this is again a question you have to weigh both sides. You have to mention how this is happening, how that means for India, and finally what space that leaves for India. Okay, so that is how we will be structuring this question. I hope we have been able to follow, but this is again on a more expected lines, we can say that. Okay, people who are still here, you can just drop a text so that I know. ठीक है, China's opportunism, Bangladesh political turmoil, etc. So China can, and this will help in reshaping. So to think of South Asia power dynamics, the moment there is a vacuum, it creates a space. So regional instability is always going to be a huge factor. Plus you can also link this to how BIMSTEC would also get weak. Yes or no? Challenging India in the Bay of Bengal. The moment I say Bay of Bengal, the dimension of BIMSTEC can also be added to this question. Okay. Okay, China is a political friend, China is a friend, etc. Some statements were made here. Okay, Bangladesh, balancing act, increasing become more difficult. So some of these articles are there. Now, this is again a question when discussing India's nuclear doctrine and India's approach while discussing Pakistan. This we have seen. The question is, would you agree with the contention? Question kya hai, would you agree? India's inclination to lean on a more aggressive, hyper-realist posture has gained a new momentum in the aftermath of Pahalgam terrorist strike. ठीक? अब question क्या है हमारा? Hyper-realist posture, right? Which means very aggressive. India has spoken about, so this we have done also, we have seen about India's decisive retaliation, India's no to any nuclear blackmail, okay? And how India's foreign policy, this has seen a shift. 2016 onward, now we have a more aggressive foreign policy. There's zero tolerance to terrorism. Okay. So here question says, would you agree that inclination has gained a new momentum in the aftermath? Is case mein, we can talk about Operation Sindoor, some of the terms that are written, and of course in the classes also we have quoted Shashi Tharoor, some of the points, and not just Shashi Tharoor, I've also quoted in the classes specifically around this. For Indus Water Treaty, okay, the Indus Water Treaty being in abeyance, and it is not just that we had a very hyper-realist strike. On the economic sense, there was action. On the international sphere, there was again the whole talk of how Pakistan again happens to be the huge harbinger of terrorism, but we had also quoted Brahmachalani, both in IWT also, Indus Water Treaty, and otherwise also. And he also said that IWT is highly generous of India to conclude, right? Because we are only getting 20% of water and we are sharing 80% of the water away. So he was critical. So we've written both the points. One of Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor presents almost a centrist side. And he was very vocal, especially during this time. He was heading the whole delegation which went. So दोनों चीज हमने देखी भी हुई थी. So this again was a relatively expected question. But again the question says hyper-realist posture, aggressive posture, okay? In terms of India's precise strikes on the terrorist camps. So some element of current affairs you will add. In this question you also have to again bring back the security calculus. At the same time you also have to mention it was not, and what other steps had we taken, not only the air warfare, on the economic front what did we do, okay, on this water front what did we do, and additionally at the international level, initially we used to do name and shame. There was a specific delegation that went so that India's actions could be justified, that we were not an aggressor in this case. Main thing you have to say, while the response is hyper-realist, but we were never the aggressor, okay, that India was only fighting for its self-defense, right? And in this question you also have to link in the rise of non-state actors. Again, Pakistan's policy of bleeding India through 1,000 cuts, it's asymmetrical warfare, and again terms like water and blood cannot flow together. So while this happens to be, you can quote Shashi Tharoor, you can quote Brahmachalani, you can also quote Dr. Ajay Shankar, some of their views, how we see this. But remember, we have used terms like India's response is non-escalatory. The attacks and the sites were chosen only they were terrorist camps. So we had we did not want escalation, etc. Right? The moment we had sufficiently retaliated, we had stopped escalation on that front. Okay? But you would add the respective terms that say India now will have to go for decisive retaliation and the threshold for escalation has reduced. Okay? So in this question, and in this question you can also bring the element that this posture also reignited the debate on the escalation to a nuclear conflict. In the class I've also told you that aftermath of this, would it lead to a nuclear escalation or not? Okay? Of course this did not happen, but even that dimension can be brought in this question. I know it's a 10 marker, you may not be able to tell all these points, okay? But jitne bhi major points hai, this is something you can add, because the moment anybody would have done Pakistan or the neighborhood, this was an expected question that can be talked about. Okay. And of course here realist, again the different approaches you can bring in to make more sense. Okay. Zero tolerance, India will never give in to nuclear blackmail. Both Jaishankar also said, Prime Minister Modi also said the same thing. Okay. Now, this is a topic, if I'm not wrong, I would have spoken by at least 5 to 10 times. I also speak the same thing in my GS classes. Okay. So when we talk about India's vision of new world order, and when I many times quote, let's say, Shyam Saran, let's say his book, How India Sees the World, or in general, when we quote Jambu Dweep, the example, we say India's vision is a multipolar world order will have a multipolar Asia. But I also contrast this claim by talking about Pax Sinica. Pax Sinica says they want a multipolar world, but they want a unipolar Asia. And this is precisely why the words of both will collide. Okay? And this is precisely why there is a challenge to the Asian century. Ab ye jo question hai hamara, if somebody has done India-China, or there's a very specific topic I always say the students to do well, vision of new world order. Do you see this topic? When you see new world order, you also understand what India stands for. So ये statement बहुत बार ऐसा नहीं कोई नया statement है. This statement has been going around. A lot of diplomats, politicians have spoken about it. India wants a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world, right? But China wants a multipolar Asia, multipolar world and a unipolar Asia. Hence the tension and conflict. So when you write this question, that is one dimension to talk about. Okay, you can quote. In fact, in the lecture that is also there on the YouTube, the last lecture on Indian foreign policy and the updates, around 6.5 hours का lecture है, crash course वाला, उसमें भी ये, and I've also quoted Pax Indica. Okay, I've also quoted Dr. Jaishankar, Why Bharat Matters, etc. The recent books. Here also the idea is same. Multipolar Asia, right? How our vision is not exclusivist. How our vision remains cosmopolitan. Fine. You can quote India's recent presidency. Or idea क्या है यहाँ पे word order का. Fundamentally, how nations operate, they also operate via this. China's vision is very exclusionary, right? That is why Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, Pax Sinica are exclusionary. India's vision of, let's say, helping out each other, okay, is standing out in that sense. Okay? Multipolar world is feasible only in multipolar Asia, etc. So regular, comprehensive, candid dialogue, etc. And again, when you see India's, let's say, culture, okay, which is why even if I talk about India's strategic culture, all of that is ultimately defined and understood through the lens of multipolar Asia. So not only do you quote certain scholars, their opinion, and how does it pan out, and also mention in this question the current state of affairs. Even now, right now, when India and China clash, why is that clash happening? Clash is not just happening because of the issues on border. The clash is happening because their worldview is different. Second, in this question, you can also say why India, again, for example, collaborates with Japan in Asia. Why India collaborates with Southeast Asia. So our neighborhood first policy, our Act East policy are driven and guided by the same dictum only. Okay? But this is again an interesting question. I think some of you would have attempted this fairly well. Class mein also we have discussed this अच्छे से, which is why word order in flux, multipolarity. अब अगर multipolar word order की बात है, India has in so many summits, be it NAM summit, BRICS summit, India has said multipolarity is the need of the hour. And not just that, we also have said reformed multilateralism is the need of the hour. Because the institutions are themselves having challenges. Okay? So this new behaviors, doctrines, definitions, India has to use this. Okay? So we can also talk about this. Okay? Multipolar word, etc. And main is, while the word is multipolar, what is India's vision? So we have also seen that India's vision is going to be like this. Okay? Okay. Now, does the non-alignment movement have any future in the wake of India's growing indifference towards it? Okay? In fact, in the class, I had also made you write an even more extreme question saying that should NAM be declared dead as a movement and as a body? So यहाँ पे तो उन्होंने यही पूछा कि what is the, does it have any future? Now NAM you also do, this is an expected question, not difficult. Now NAM you also do in paper 2A, NAM you also do in paper 2B. Now, while it is true that the heads of state are not visiting NAM, but we can quote the most recent RAM summit. In the class we've also done the recent Kampala declaration. This we have done extensively, right? And here also India has still reaffirmed the support for South-South cooperation. Even Dr. S. Jaishankar in his speech has outlined that NAM as a movement, the values for which it was standing, those challenges, abhi bhi world mein kya kya issues hain? Global North, Global South have challenges. Global South is again having inequitable development. What are the other challenges we can say? Abhi bhi issues hai of the multilateral world order is against Global South. We saw that, yes. IMF, WTO, etc. World Bank, they are still against, or they are still not totally representative of the Global South, right? There is arms race going on. There's a nuclear threat going on. There's a rise of wars that is happening. UN is not able to control all of that, and climate disasters, climate change, all of that points to the challenge which the international order is facing. So NAM remains relevant as long as the challenges for which it was created remains. So we will write that, yes, it remains relevant. Of course, yes, India's leadership, India was again Jawaharlal Nehru amongst the 5 members. He was the founding father also. While in the recent times, we have not had a lot of headway, but we still participate. So as it would be incorrect to say India has a growing indifference towards it. So a question was loaded hai. This question is slightly negative in the tone. Here examiner is trying to check whether you answer exactly like the tone of the question or would you answer in a more critical lens. Because here also we can quote, okay, on this front. Now, इसी से मिलता जुलते एक कुछ articles भी हैं, जैसे for example, a very recent article. And in the class I also told you that this was the 70 years of Bandung Conference. Bandung Conference happened in 1955. Today's, well, this is 2025. So here, if you just see the article tone in Indian Express, India's amnesia on Bandung. What is amnesia? You forget something. Is a symptom of what ails our foreign policy. So this, of course, Manoj Kumar Jha, etc., is also arguing in this case कि भाई India must reclaim the distinctive voice that once commanded attention in global forums. Right? So this also tells you that ultimately the tone of the article says that yes, there is an indifference, but we should take proactive steps to again reclaim the leader of the global south. India also was there in the Voice of the Global South Summit. So we have to take more proactive steps to ensure this happens. Okay? Verbosity, moral clarity, consistency of positions, etc. Because right now, this is an opportune time. So these kind of questions will be there. अगली बार फिर से वो किसी और तरह से पूछ सकते हैं आपको NAM को सवाल. So you should be prepared to answer these questions. Okay? NAM का केस because this year articles थे क्यों? देखो, this is where. Classes में भी ये हमने साफ साफ लिखा है, इस पे और भी तरह के questions कर रखे थे. So those who have been following this, okay, in general, you would have been able to attempt it. 70 years I had told you of this. Fine. Now, the historical ties between India and Japan grew into a special strategic and global partnership. This I think should be an easy question. Okay, right from the introduction, PM Shinzo Abe, economic cooperation, shared adversaries like China, complementarities in Indian Ocean, their let's say having close relations with Quad. Okay, other than that, they're collaborating in Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Japan has so much of money invested through its, the Delhi Metro, all these projects. So the main thing is, you have to focus also on strategic, which means security oriented. So of course, Quad will come here. Okay, global partnerships में जैसे AAGC, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, again overall cooperation in Indo-Pacific and development of Northeast, etc., etc., through certain scholarly analysis. So this I don't think should be a problem. Something landmark has happened between India and Japan very recently. क्या हुआ है बताओ? Anybody who's watching this अभी online? And that is something you can write here separately. One of the biggest trade deals has happened. Okay, huge in terms of its volume. Okay, so even that can be mentioned here. That how this talks to you about the historical ties. So ये ऐसे questions है, you want such questions in the exam. आपने practice किया होगा, class में अच्छे से पढ़ रखा होगा, revise किया है, इसको लिखा आपने, ठीक है? Now, do you see there is a difference in paper 2 and paper 2B this year? 2B थोड़ा doable ज़्यादा लग रहा है, सुना हुआ ज़्यादा लग रहा है. So this was the experience of people also. Fine. So although it means if 2A is tougher, there is no guarantee next year maybe 2B is tougher. You have to be prepared. What makes a question tough is the phrasing of questions. Sometimes आपने election commission जैसे पढ़ रखा है. In 1B they had asked you very specifically about chief election commissioner and election commissioners. The moment a question becomes very narrowed down, very specific, it makes it more challenging. Okay, so that is one. और भी ये military exercises है, right? चलो economy के sense में है, 20 years of strategic partnership. Okay, this can also be one reason why this was there. ORF, for example, can be a good site. Last में I'll also tell you what to track and sometimes what are the good areas to go through. Fine, this can also be one. 20 years testament to shared commitment, regional stability, democratic values, etc. Right? We can talk about that. Now, they critically analyze. Some people may have had challenge. For our students, this was a cakewalk. Critically analyze. In fact, I'll tell you different phases of foreign policy since independence. How justified do you think is S. Jaishankar's classification of current phase as the phase of energetic diplomacy? Now, both in my classes of GS, okay, in fact, you have already done that class, and in my classes of PSIR, of course, PSIR we do in far more detail. ये मेरे पहले पेज का handout है, पहला पेज, the very first page. What is foreign policy? Objectives, phases. In the classes, we go into every phase in more detail, and then I'll give you commentaries based on this. Okay? That what is the continuity and change in Indian foreign policy. So, a very good way is to understand it through S. Jaishankar. So, directly, this is a direct question. And please note, the question says 15 plus 5, which means you have to analyze different phases of Indian foreign policy. Normally, such a wide question is not getting asked. Normally, लोग क्या करेंगे? अभी recent पढ़ लेते क्या हुआ है. So, in this question, for 15 marks, you have to know India's history. ठीक है? Even in last year, उससे भी पहले, this is something which I constantly feature. So those who have followed this well, and by the way, this is the very first page of the document. Okay? We have done this also. In fact, ये जो point है energetic diplomacy का, this also we have covered in continuity and change in Indian foreign policy. Okay? How do we say this is more energetic? Give me examples. चलो पहला rise of economic diplomacy, more FTAs, more trade deals. Second, more security related partnerships. Third, more focus on diaspora. Fourth, defense and aggressive and muscular hyper realist foreign policy. Yes, और सोचो, how is it energetic? जैसे look east became act east, right? More focus on, let's say, Indo-Pacific maritime diplomacy, evacuation efforts of diaspora, far better. That is the point you have to write. And when you write from Dr. S. Jaishankar, quote J.N. Dixit. We started what is foreign policy through J.N. Dixit. Okay? Other scholars, for example, हमने एक ये भी book लिखी from Chanakya to Modi. How has Indian foreign policy evolved? Aparna Pandey. Okay? Teresa Schaffer. Some of the commentaries that we have done. So this question would have been solved fairly well, I am assuming. Okay? And this, somebody who has done the basics of your 2B, this is not a difficult one. Fine? So we want these kind of questions to emerge in the class. ठीक है, ऐसे बहुत अच्छे सवाल अच्छे रहेंगे. किसी ने book भी पढ़ रखी है, Why Bharat Matters, etc. You also get to add more details to it. Okay, so this can be done fairly well. So that is also one point. Okay, C. Rajamohan, again some of these points we can talk about. Now, Indo-Pacific as a theme, we have also done in paper 2A, we have also done in 2B. In fact, these are the questions that will give you confidence in the exam. Right? India maintains strong ties with countries that assure free and open Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific where a separate handout was there. We started with what is India's vision. We want a free, open, inclusive, prosperous, rules-based Indo-Pacific. Right? We had also quoted Prime Minister Modi in Shangri-La dialogue. He spoke about ASEAN centrality as the core feature of Indo-Pacific. How India and US complement. How India, Japan, of course, all of them come together, and then you see what? The rise of Quad. Yes or no? Can we say Quad? So even Quad then becomes an important point in this manner, right? So even we can talk about Quad. Other than that, दूसरा क्या है? Guarantee regional greater connectivity with rest of the world. Okay? So we'll also talk about, in fact, in this question you can again link, we've also done in the class 6th Quad Summit. This is also there in the last lecture, which is there on the YouTube. The very last lecture of a crash course. उसमें से भी Dr. S. Jaishankar and all the points related to this, how we want to have better connectivity, rules-based order, transparent, okay, mechanisms. So this again, Indo-Pacific is an important theme, not only this year, but in the coming 4-5 years, every time some different dimension of this will get asked. ठीक है? अभी इस पे पूछा, अगली बार पूछ सकते हैं maritime domain awareness पे और maritime security पे. Other, they can ask you more specific question, how will India operationalize it? Other question can be, what are the non-traditional security threats that India faces in the Indo-Pacific, even that can be a question that can be asked, yes or no? So the examiner will keep on changing, the theme would remain same. So which is why theme Indo-Pacific is very important, and you will take shots at China also here. You'll talk about how China can be a threat to achieving peace, prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region, even that can be a point you can mention. Yes? Fine, so even that is, I think, one you can talk about. Now other than that, there are also a couple of points we'll also write. Okay? 1 second. Next question पे आते हैं. So even with the smaller Pacific island, we are having collaboration. So again, I can give you examples of Sagar, security and growth for all. In the class, we've also done Mahasagar. Okay. Then we've also done, in this case, even more details about FIPIC. Okay. India's IONS, IORA, BIMSTEC, various multilateral institutions also collaborating with the vision of Indo-Pacific. Even that can be mentioned here. So can we say that also? Yes. India's strategic arena. Ab is question mein how you link theories. When I start Indo-Pacific, I always tell you Alfred T. Mahan. Those who rules the oceans rules the world. Okay, so use those thinkers, use the theories, create a good answer. This is not a difficult one. Okay. Now, the tariff threats have pushed India and EU closer. Evaluate India-EU partnership. Now, India-EU partnership, all the recent details, etc., the issues of BTIA we have done. In this question, also bring in the dimension of tariff threats. Now, in our document, we've also seen how Brexit creates an opportunity for both India and UK and also for India and EU. Same hai issue tariff threats ka. Tariff threat is a global concern, global problem. But any problem will also have a solution or at least create an opportunity, right? So from that angle, at least from the economic angle, we can explore the very first part. Second question kya keh rahe, you have to evaluate India-EU partnership. The biggest thorn. So see, there are some good things. Collaboration on economic aspect. They're also now collaborating on Indo-Pacific. Okay, so certain joint developments are also happening. The respective countries, be it France, etc. There is a good partnership. This is also there, right? So you will talk about multi-sectoral collaboration and partnerships. But the challenge still remains. Okay, the trade is an issue. In trade, you can talk about sanitary and phytosanitary barriers are there. BTIA, broad. The trade investment agreement, even this is not yet finalized. Okay. Third is China. Now some countries of Europe have joined Belt and Road Initiative. So on that front, it is not very clear. Then another issue is the issue of Russia-Ukraine. India did not abstain. In fact, India did not speak against Russia. So Europe and other countries have been vocal against India's stance. Okay, that India has not criticized the Russian actions. That can also be a cause of tension. Sometimes EU and its groups speak about the issues of minorities in India. So there is a difference of challenges hain yahan pe, but of course there is a huge area of cooperation as well, which is also seen. So both points, this also is a topic. Direct, जो भी topics direct हैं, जो कुछ कर रखे, तो I am not over explaining, but yes, paper 2A में जो challenges थे, वो हमने और detail में देखे हैं. So these are some of the topics we can write on. Okay, with relevant scholars, we have seen that. Okay, so we can do that. So ये भी news में था, EFTA, Piyush Goyal, etc. This was there. Okay, some of the points, let's say Wonderland. This is not a term to place limits on India-EU cooperation, which simply means there can be a more multi-layered cooperation on their front. Okay. Gateway for India. Okay, the reset. ये मैंने आपको point बताया था. UK-EU reset has the potential to redefine India's trade. So something that has happened in the past, I'll use that as an example, and I will again create more dimensions and points based on that. This also we can do. Yes. Now, India diplomacy, etc. with EU, USA. ये भी point है Shubhajit Roy against some of these articles. Again a point I would want to say, whatever block, let's say you are feeling not very confident, हो सकता है आपके लिए Latin America हो, किसी के लिए Africa हो, etc. On those blocks, at least read 2 or 3 articles. Right now there's a culture of summaries and then summaries and summaries ke 1-pagers. You will understand them better when you've read a good article on that. Fine. So abhi bhi the people who are preparing for 2026 and beyond, my sincere advice is take one block at a time. Okay. and slowly build on your knowledge. अगर आपने अच्छे से पढ़ रखा है ना तो एटलीस्ट पेपर 2 आपके लिए बहुत रिवॉर्डिंग होगा. There are people who score very high marks in paper 2. The reason for that is you assemble and internalize all these things. Now even some of the topics that I taught in the recent crash course just 1 or 2 months back, the tone of India and US has not changed. Yes or no? India China have become slightly more closer now. So IR is constantly changing, international relations, and sometimes it radically changes in the span of 4, 5, 6 months. So somebody who has done, let's say, किसी ने बहुत पहले पढ़ रखा है IR, अब पढ़ोगे तो shifts have only have changed. The underlying concerns have changed. So you have to keep on updating yourself. Which is why current affairs is an aspect you cannot ignore in this. By now, it should be amply clear to you that current affairs is something we cannot ignore. Okay? Fine, I think we have seen this. FTA है कुछ है, क्योंकि यहाँ पे FTA वाला part काफी तरह से बोल सकते हैं. Now, question 7A. Again, a very interesting question. And this question talks to you in depth about the concept of strategic autonomy. Now, India continues to invoke its time-tested policy of strategic autonomy vis-a-vis both the USA and Russia by rejecting US offer on mediation on Kashmir. Okay? So, एक point ये हो गया. And by refusing to criticize Russia in its ongoing war. Question किस पे आया? And the question says this is a time-tested policy of India, strategic autonomy. Almost every year, this is also a theme that gets asked. Sometimes you can be asked a question, what is the success of India in West Asia? The reason is strategic autonomy. We're able to have very good relations with Israel, with Palestine, with Iran, with other Gulf nations, Arab nations, without boxing or let's say putting any of them in a corner. Yes or no? So in this question, the question is twofold. So in this question, of course, you have to define what is strategic autonomy. It's a 20 marker, तो इसमें बताना पड़ेगा. Through NAM, we focused on strategic autonomy. We did not want to be put into any of the blocks. And how India's strategic autonomy has evolved over a period of time. Okay. So one, through its Kashmir, and because it's a 20 marker, you can also give the background. India does not entertain, does not want any third party mediation. It says, why this is our internal matter, we can also solve that. Right. Second, India also refuses to criticize Russia in the ongoing war. Okay, even this is true. When you also talk about this, you can even give more points. You can give why. दोनों केस में why बताना पड़ेगा. And also both the cases rationale. What do you think is the rationale why India wants strategic autonomy? क्यों? I'll just take your doubt, Ram, just after a few moments, how the note making part of this. हाँ, बताओ. बिल्कुल सही है. One is sovereignty issues, third party mediation. Second thing is, India wants to have its own choices. We already had a huge experience of being under colonial domination. We wanted to have our own choices. Our own choices, our own autonomy, our independence was integral to us. Also in NAM and even post-NAM. Okay, so the issues of India's sovereignty in this case, okay, which we can explain why India does not want this. Again, somebody's interference. Second, you also, last year a question आया था that India and US, India does not see, सवाल आया था ally. India is not a US ally. Same सवाल. So if you're seeing this question, write this and compare it to last year. Same question tha, the sentiment is also changed. Sentiment is also same. So India is not an ally of US. What is the meaning of that? If you are an ally, you have to toe with them. Because USA has a lot of NATO allies. India sees itself as a partner. Okay, we have our own points, which is why even when we refuse Russia, yahan pe you can also bring the angle of CAATSA. That despite CAATSA sanctions, we are still able to procure S-400. Okay, we are still able to get Russian oil. Although the moment I say Russian oil, Trump has made this whole issue being very public that India still continues to buy Russian oil, it continues to support war, etc. Uski वजह से बहुत challenges हुए. Okay. So when I say this, in this question you have to examine India's strategic autonomy. You have to quote, okay, right from Jawaharlal Nehru to our diplomats or in the recent times, the importance of strategic autonomy for an India. Okay, because if India loses a strategic autonomy, we cannot be the voice of global south, we cannot lead our own cause. You have to again choose between these sides. तो अगर क्वेश्चन में यूएस को बता रहा है और रशिया को बता रहा है, the hidden theme is the strategic rivalry, the great global power competition, and India does not want to choose any sides. And when India refuses to criticize Russia, we have our own interests. So this question also tells you the prime objective of foreign policy is to safeguard national interest. Again, Morgenthau says the same thing. Yes or no? So we can write these points again and again. Can we say that? Yes? तो ये काफी अच्छा क्वेश्चन है. अब आपके लिए चैलेंज क्या होगा? And this is again, I want those who are seeing this, whenever you are seeing this, I want you to structure this question. किसी को लगेगा सर 20 marks 4 pages में कैसे fill करूं? If you have this issue, the best thing that you can do here is structure. सोचो एक introduction होगा. There will be a body. In the body, I'll talk about strategic autonomy, where this was seen. So when you create a structure, your mind gets very clear. Those who are new to answer writing, don't assume you will do everything automatic. It is only through, let's say we have our answer writing programs, PSI 300, जो भी है, वहाँ पे भी ये चीज़ बार-बार करनी पड़ती है अपने को. And when the structure is clear in your mind, then you can write a very good answer. But that means iterations. So in this question, if you create a structure, you define, you start the question, you define what is strategic autonomy, where India demonstrated, why India demonstrated it. Then you give the rationale for both of them, and you support it by some supporting examples. You also can make the mention of ally. ये question है 2024 mains का. Those of you who have not seen the analysis, again I have taken it. I think this is on the 2nd or 3rd of June of 2025. Sorry, not 2025. नहीं, of course, 2025 में तो लिया है मैंने. So this you can see that. Okay, so you can just go through the previous videos. So you can keep connecting it. But this is an interesting question. Yes or no? So you can do that. Again, you can link it to certain books. Okay. US threatens to quit mediation efforts unless concrete proposals are there, etc. Okay. Trump mediation offer puts India in a tight spot. Okay. Now, somebody was asking, and I'll just answer your question. देखो, if you have a habit of reading some of the articles, only the very important ones, you can just write essence in 3 or 4 lines, something which stands out. Your summary should not be huge, और summary बनाओ topic wise. जैसे अगर USA का कोई specific है point, उस पे बना लो, notes को complement करने के लिए. Okay. If Africa, there's new dimension that you can add, or at least keep a habit of taking some screenshots, which you can later on synthesize and summarize. Okay, so you have to keep on doing this again and again. Okay, now let's see the last almost remaining questions. Trump's unilateral impositions of tariffs, etc., threat to the future of multilateral institutions under WTO. What options does WTO member have to salvage this? Okay? Now, the context of this is Trump has, or let's say USA, has not been appointing any of the members to DSB, the Dispute Settlement Board of WTO, and WTO is again in a state of almost suspended animation. Okay, ये है point. और फिर से आप देखो Trump and tariffs. The moment you have a tariff war, does that also not mean the international world order is in a state of crisis? Right? Because what is the work of WTO? So इस question में starting में will tell the role of WTO is to ensure multilateral order, free and fair trade. But even WTO is facing a setback or a challenge because its members, or let's say the DSB, has not seen appropriate representation. Can we say that? Yes or no? बात कर सकते हैं हम लोग? Okay. So that is one thing which we'll outline properly, number one. And post that, what we can say? Threat to the rules-based multilateral global institutions. Fine? इसको explain करेंगे under WTO. What option does WTO members have? Now, WTO members, of course, there is a ministerial conference that they have. But other than that, also we've discussed some of the options. अब options क्या हो सकते हैं WTO के? Ultimately, you can also have reforms in WTO, at least at some level. One point we can say, in reforms you need consensus. अब यहाँ पे एक question आ चुका है पिछले साल भी. India as the leader, voice of the global south. India through Doha development agenda, India in other trade negotiations has been very vocal about the voice of global south. Okay, so India can also be one, but it is not just India. Within WTO there are also certain groups. ठीक है, जैसे आपने सुना होगा L69, G77, etc., etc. Other groups which can again talk about. So WTO members can talk about its reform, number one. But other institutions, NAM is also talking about reform of WTO, BRICS is also talking about reform of WTO. So in this question, while you talk about what WTO members can also do, but additionally through other organizations, what can be done can also be spoken about in this case. Okay? WTO is again one topic we've also done in 2A and also 2B. This was a dimension we have also, at least to large extent, covered. So this should also give you some clarity on how this is to be done. Okay? So I think this is something we can talk about. Now, फिर देखो ये बताया हमने अभी भी in the recent BRICS summit they have voiced concerns about USA violating WTO. So question WTO का don't think that you cannot bring BRICS or NAM. They also talk about reform of global multilateral institutions. In fact, India has also said we want and support the reform of global multilateral institutions. Okay, that is one. Trump has killed WTO, mounted a challenge to rules-based order, etc. Former finance minister, etc. We can talk about that. Okay. This is also one. So again, a lot of points we can talk about. Now, NAM 2.0 underscores India's unique aspirations to emerge as a site for alternative universality. एक और question है NAM पे. Now, NAM 2.0 as a book or a document is slightly old. Way back in 2013, this had come. But if you again apply your common sense and common logic, the point is non-alignment as a movement faded away after Cold War, right? So when we say what is the non-alignment then, and sometimes it is said non-alignment has become multi-alignment, okay? So NAM 2.0 actually reimagines the concept of non-alignment, क्योंकि movement जो खत्म हो गया, we have to again reimagine for ourselves. Second is then what is the meaning of strategic autonomy? So here non-alignment has almost transformed itself into multi-alignment, that you will be engaged on an issue and cooperation and national interest basis, yet you will not choose any sides. Okay, so how this has been reimagined, how it talks about India's unique aspirations, site for alternative universality, right? So this is what, so जिसको अगर नहीं पता है, so again my homework for you would be, this is a 2013, एक बहुत पतली सी book भी है NAM 2.0 पे, this is also what you can read, okay? Otherwise, just make a short note of NAM 2.0 because this is a slightly older topic, but still based on what you know on NAM, okay, and how the concept of non-alignment has evolved post the NAM movement being not very functional because the Cold War ended. So which is why the question also was on this front. This is what we can write. Okay, so I think this also makes sense. इसको एक second हाँ लिख सकते हैं. Now, the last remaining block that we have for ourselves, India's reluctance to perceive any existential threat inevitably made the multilateral path to nuclear security a default option until it decided to cross the nuclear rubicon in 1998. Okay, there were two major things. Okay, so this 1998 again is the year when we again had our nuclear tests. So we had Pokhran 1 in 1974, Pokhran 2 happened in 1998. अब क्वेश्चन क्या है, आइडेंटिफाई एंड एनालाइज सम ऑफ द मेजर रीजंस बिहाइंड दिस शिफ्ट इन इंडियाज पोजीशन ऑन द न्यूक्लियर क्वेश्चन. क्वेश्चन है क्या, दैट इंडिया वांटेड टू बिकम अ डी फैक्टो पावर, एंड द मोमेंट दिस हैपेंड वी सॉ अ न्यूक्लियर अपार्थीड एज वेल. ओके, सो अगेन इन दिस क्वेश्चन you have different kinds of view. For example, you have a expansionist view. Okay, let's say you have somebody like a Bharat Karnad, you have somebody like a Rajesh Rajgopalan, who will give the reasons why we did this. But there is also a centrist view in the same category. For example, let's say if I talk about Dhruv Jaishankar, who also will say, so इस question में please don't write it in a single manner. ठीक है, people who are watching this online also, in this question what they are asking you, that especially Pokhran 2 and India's nuclear doctrine का सवाल है. Okay, this also we do here. So main thing is, what were the reasons that India crossed the nuclear Rubicon? What were the reasons which, let's say, motivated India to carry out its nuclear tests, which let's say are the Pokhran 2 tests? Fine. So इसमें में there is a diversity and a range of scholars that one can quote through. India ने ऐसा क्यों किया? So of course one view is the expansionist view. In this case also, you can also quote K. Subramaniam, the chief architect of India's nuclear policy. Okay, so some of these points can be talked about. तो इसको आप लिख सकते हैं. But generally speaking, if you have not prepared, there is a topic of Indian. Normally, a question you would expect from the topic will be current oriented, right? For example, in the aftermath of the Pahalgam and the Operation Sindoor, there was also a question that should India revisit its nuclear doctrine, okay? So that is also one thing, but again here the point to understand here is, they've asked you the reasons as to why India crossed the nuclear Rubicon and we embrace this path, ठीक है? So when you read now, ये topic फिर से देखो, what was India's motivations? Second, India's nuclear doctrine in the current time, okay? So this is also one, okay? Okay, ठीक है. Redeeming nuclear power promise, etc., etc. We चलो India amend. Now, another question. In fact, this question we have done in the class also, right? The key drivers, and I'm discussing the paper of Paul Science अभी जो हुआ है ना, that वाला हाँ. The key drivers of India's new interest in Africa, which might help in developing long-term comparative advantage over China. In this question, we see one more thing. In GS2 of 2025 mains, you also see one specific question on India-Africa digital partnership. Similar question getting repeated. Let's say this is Africa. While talking of Africa, we have spoken about the Africa vision of 2063, okay? And the question simply says that, what are the key drivers of India's new interest in Africa, okay? In our class, we've also done PM Modi's 10 points on India-Africa. वो अपन हमने कर रखा है. Second is, what are the new interests? So right from the space for agri startups, okay, to the space for new materials, okay, to the space for development of infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, various sectors which tell us India's new interests in Africa, number one. Second thing is developing a long-term comparative advantage. So for example, when I say India and Japan, they are collaborating in AAGC, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. This is nothing but an alternative to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That is one point. And the question says long-term comparative advantage. Again, in one of the PM Modi's 10 points on Africa, he also says, we will create development for you. Okay? So Chinese development does not include local development. Chinese development has debt trap. Okay? A lot of checkbook diplomacy, opaque policies. But India can create a long-term comparative advantage. Right? If you read your economics, comparative advantage, again a theory made famous by Ricardo. So if India focuses on soft power, creating avenues, helping in the development of Africa, this will be a win-win. And India and Africa again have a lot of complementarities. NAM mein dekhenge agar, okay, even in the Global South cooperation that we have. In the recent G2017, the summit which happened, African Union was brought in as a member of G20 also. So we can club all these points, plus we have done a lot of scholars also here who talked about India and Africa cooperation. So this again happens to be one of the questions which we can write on, okay. So that is one. Now, conflicts bhi hai, challenges bhi hai, etc. And of course, India's increasing outreach is now not limited to certain sections. Now it is more that we want to visit Pan-Africa as a continent, right? Okay, so there is extractive models. If you see this statement by External Affairs Minister, unlike the extractive models, what is the meaning of extractive models here? There is a reference to China and its Belt Road Initiative, yes or no? So we can talk about that. Now, India's vision for Africa, this also we had done in the class, okay? In fact, Africa and Latin America, दोनों अच्छे से कर रखा है, दोनों पूछे गए इस बार एग्जाम में, fine? India's vision for Africa, okay? There is a FTA that is being supported, Africa vision of 2063, right? And then we move to the last question. Discuss the potential role of which India can play in initiating a possible phase. Question is possible trilateral economic engagement with India, China, Nepal, right? Now this question is saying potential and also possible. So of course you do not have to argue from one side that this is going to be possible. Why? Because this is already fraught with challenges. Challenges kya hai? Nepal is doing cartographic aggression. How come? They're changing the map. Limpiadhura, Lipo Lake, Kalapani. Increased presence of China in Nepal is again a strategic, let's say, challenge for India. Very close to chicken snake corridor, etc., etc. Other than that, China, Nepal again being a part of BRI. but the question says what is the potential, okay, in case somebody is just coming, आप उनको बुला लो, है ना, if somebody wants to enter the class. The potential which India can play in trilateral. So now you have to see the avenues and areas of cooperation. But कभी भी इस question को one sided argue मत करो. Even if you say there are elements of cooperation available, this can only be possible if these differences to some extent are managed. Okay, so for example, avenues for cooperation can also be hydel, can also be on the context of, so यहाँ पे है जैसे trilateral economic cooperation, it can be hydel, economic, but this would require substantial disengagement on the border front. You can give the example of the recent disengagement and possible better relations between India and China. We have used our terms class में जैसे like elephant, dragon, tango, and the possibility of an Asian century. But when you end this question, also end with a rider, okay, that this can only happen when all the three countries ultimately have systematic dialogue mechanisms. When their word order, the सबसे बड़ा challenge क्या है? That India sees a multipolar Asia, China sees a unipolar Asia. That is the fundamental conflict in the word order as well, right? So when you write this, इसीलिए question में potential लिखा है. Even when you talk about the potential, the second half of the question is the potential is fraught with challenges. Okay, this is what you would have to write in this particular question. ठीक है, कैसे energy export हो सकती है, hydel export हो सकता है. That is one part. Fine. Okay, so with this we come to the end of the discussion. Okay, so we have touched upon all the major aspects, right? Some of the advices I've written here, even if you see now the PSIR paper 2, the 2B section, one thing that is very obvious is even in 2A there's a huge current affairs portion. In 2B also this is there, right? The questions have interlinkages, which also means our preparation should include that. In current affairs, most of the questions are on expected topics. There's no question that is standing out that you do not know anything about it, okay? But there are a couple of questions which have gone slightly behind. For example, even in the case of Indian foreign policy, okay, they have taken a note of a speech of 2019, although we've covered it extensively, all the 6 phases of foreign policy, etc. But the question examiner is also hinting you that you have to go beyond. It is not just 1 year, you have to have a comprehensive knowledge. First is this. Second, even in the question on nuclear, they've asked you 1998 and the motivations behind why India crossed the nuclear rubicon, right? In this question also, they are expecting you to go slightly beyond, right? Which also means coverage of lesser read topics, be it Latin America, be it Africa, nuclear question, or some of the recent trade deals, you have to go beyond. But largely speaking, paper 2B this year was more doable, which is why most of the students have done more, at least one question more in 2B. Second, we've already discussed what is, let's say, the case in paper 2A. So finally, if I have to conclude, right, use these discussions. So I've also done paper analysis of 2024, you can watch that. We've also done 2025, you can also watch that. And then whatever questions we've discussed, try to make the outline, try to make the framework, right? The people online who are watching, again, in case if you have a doubt, if you want to reach out, this is the number on which you can drop a message. We'll try to contact you if this is an issue, especially for the people who want to decode the paper well. Okay, this is what you can reach out on. Okay. Additionally, if you have any other issue related to the paper, any question that you want a more detailed understanding, we can discuss that also. Okay. So with that said, I'll take your leave now. Okay. So any other points you wanted to discuss, you can drop me a text. Okay. Thank you.